Welcome to the Royal Dining Hall, a glittering arena where silverware gleamed brighter than moral integrity, and every fork was sharper than the conversation. Here, food wasn't just food, it was diplomacy seasoned with ego, a political weapon served in 12 courses. If you thought hosting the in-laws was stressful, try seating your enemies 3 chairs away from your assassination plot. From ancient Persia to the courts of Europe, royal banquets were less about eating and more about being seen eating. The glittering gold plates weren't there because soup tasted better on 24-carat metal. They were a reminder that the monarch's wealth could outshine any candlelight and any rival. Each course was theatre. The way a king sipped wine could signal favour. The order of service could elevate one noble family and humiliate another. Forget diplomacy through treaties. The true negotiations happened between the roast and the dessert. Take medieval Europe, for instance. The table was where alliances were made and unmade faster than the kitchen could clear the plates. Nobles jockeyed for proximity to the monarch, because distance from the royal chair wasn't just social, it was political. Sit too far away and you were basically on the waiting list for exile. Sit too close and congratulations, you're either trusted or tomorrow's court gossip headline. It was like an ancient version of musical chairs, except the loser didn't just lose a seat, they might lose a province. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring, you can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Royal tables weren't just platforms for eating, they were stages for survival. Invitations were political currency. Being invited to dine meant recognition, favour, and sometimes safety. Being uninvited, that was practically a death omen, at least for your career. One misstep at dinner could end a dynasty faster than an invading army. Because kings and queens were watching everything, who toasted too enthusiastically, who reached for bread before the monarch, who dared to cough during grace. And the food itself carried messages. The number of dishes symbolised the kingdom's prosperity. Exotic ingredients, spices from the east, fruits from foreign ports, were edible propaganda. Proof of empire and power. Serving oranges in Tudor England was like saying, we have global influence and vitamin C. But behind the spectacle there was also fear. Poison was a constant dinner guest, invisible but ever present. The ceremonial tasters, the silver goblets thought to react to toxins, and the intricate rituals of serving were all less about elegance and more about survival. Nothing said royalty like having your butler possibly die for you before dessert. The seating order itself was a masterpiece of political choreography. The king or queen sat elevated, literally on a higher platform, while nobles ranked by a status sat below, like steps on a human pyramid of envy. The hierarchy was so strict that one misplaced chair could spark a feud. In 1661, at a diplomatic banquet in London, France and Spain nearly went to war over who got to sit closer to the host. Picture it, ambassadors elbowing each other in brocade coats, while servants quietly prayed no one spilled the soup on a prince. In Asia too, royal banquets were subtle chess games. In the Forbidden City, Emperor Qianlong's imperial feasts blended ritual and intimidation, each dish a symbol of cosmic order. Guests were expected to praise the emperor's wisdom between bites, which was probably challenging when your meal involved swallowing jellyfish for flattery. The idea was clear. Eating in the presence of the ruler wasn't nourishment. It was a performance of loyalty, hierarchy, and control. Even the entertainment had political undertones. Minstrels, dancers, or jesters were there to flatter the host's reputation, and sometimes to distract from awkward silences. In medieval courts, the arrival of a boar's head or an elaborate pie often hid a deeper meaning, sometimes literally. There were feasts where live birds flew out of pastries, symbolising abundance and power, though to the guests beneath them, it probably felt more like an airborne health hazard. Royal feasts were also opportunities for espionage. Servants, cooks, and cup-bearers the invisible backbone of every banquet, often doubled as informants. They overheard whispered alliances, caught glimpses of secret notes, and sometimes slipped a few too many special ingredients into a rival's dish. In some courts, being a cook was more dangerous than being a soldier. One wrong spice and you might end up as the next course. But perhaps the most ironic thing about these feasts was that the monarchs themselves often didn't enjoy them. The food was usually cold by the time it reached the royal plate, thanks to the elaborate rituals and slow procession of courses. Many kings were forced to nibble politely while everyone else watched in reverence. A royal dinner was less bon appetit and more, behold, I am symbolically chewing for national stability, and heaven forbid anyone outshine the monarch's meal. When a duke in Burgundy once threw a feast so extravagant it made the king look frugal, he was accused of treason by over-catering. In royal logic, generosity could be suspicious, and good taste could get you killed. So when we talk about royal banquets, remember, these weren't casual dinners, they were wars fought with ladles instead of lances, where the seating chart mattered as much as the sword. Every toast was a gamble, every dish a message, and every smile a mask. The royal dining hall wasn't just where people ate, it was where power was digested, one dangerous bite at a time. The good news? You're invited. The bad news? You might not survive dessert. Few myths about ancient Rome have clung to history's digestive tract, quite like the idea of the vomitorium, that supposedly designated space where gluttonous Romans excused themselves mid-banquet to, well, lighten the load and make room for more flamingo tongues. It's an image so vivid you can almost hear the marble echo, the sound of luxury meeting nausea. The only problem? It's pure nonsense. There wasn't a room for throwing up. Oh. The entire dining room did the job just fine. Let's rewind. The legend goes that Rome's elite, those toga-wrapped champions of decadence, would eat until bursting, slip away to the vomitorium, purge elegantly, and then return for dessert as if nothing had happened. To modern ears, it fits perfectly with everything we think we know about Roman excess, the couches, the grapes, the orgies, and the suspiciously short lifespans. But the truth is far less grotesque, though possibly even more interesting. The term vomitorium didn't refer to a marble-tiled puke palace. It referred to architecture, not anatomy. In Latin, vomere means to spew forth, and Roman engineers, being poetic as well as practical, used it to describe the passageways in amphitheatres and stadiums that allowed crowds to spew out quickly after events. The vomitoria, plural, were exit corridors, the ancient equivalent of an audience evacuation plan. So next time you leave a concert through an exit tunnel, congratulations. You've just walked through a vomitorium. Try not to take that personally. The real marvel is how this mistranslation became one of the longest-running historical urban legends ever. The myth gained traction centuries later during the 19th century, when Victorian writers, who adored moralizing about the sins of ancient civilizations while secretly envying their parties, reinterpreted the word to fit their prudish disgust with Roman luxury. Nothing delighted a Victorian moralist more than the idea of wealthy pagans throwing up between courses while wearing gold sandals. It confirmed everything they wanted to believe about decadence and moral decay, and it made for great dinner conversation. Ironically, the Romans didn't even need such rooms. They were perfectly capable of overindulgence without architectural assistance. Accounts from historians like Seneca describe men eating to absurd excess, washing down eels and lampreys with wine strong enough to stun a gladiator. The Romans had a phrase for this lifestyle, vomere post cibum, to vomit after food. It wasn't a compliment, it was a moral warning. Philosophers considered it disgusting, not fashionable. Even the most jaded patrician understood that throwing up mid-meal wasn't an elegant dining technique. It was an admission that you'd lost a duel against your own stomach. Of course, there's no denying that some Romans pushed their appetites to Olympian levels. Feasts hosted by emperors like Nero or Vitellius became legendary for excess. Vitellius, who ruled briefly in 69 CE, was rumoured to consume more meals in a day than most soldiers ate in a week. He once ordered a dish containing the livers of pike, the brains of pheasants, and the tongues of flamingos, all mixed in a single sauce. Imagine that moment when the chef proudly announces, "Dinner is ready," and half the room wonders whether it's safe to breathe near the platter. Still, even for these culinary thrill-seekers, vomiting wasn't a glamorous ritual. It was the body's revenge. So where did the myth really take hold? In the Renaissance and later, when Europeans rediscovered classical texts but occasionally misunderstood the Latin. Some early translators stumbled upon references to vomitoria in architectural contexts and, lacking Google but having vivid imaginations, assumed it meant a literal vomit room. And because nothing spreads faster than a story that makes you feel morally superior to your ancestors, the myth endured. The irony, of course, is that Romans were obsessed with order, cleanliness, and decorum at the table, at least in theory. Dining etiquette was so detailed that manuals existed explaining how to recline gracefully without exposing too much leg or spilling wine on your toga. A Roman feast was a social contract. Elegance in posture, wit in conversation, and moderation in appearance. You could gorge privately, but looking like you were gorging, barbaric. A true Roman would rather die quietly and with dignity than let out an undignified burp before the emperor. Even the lavish convivia, banquets of the elite had structure. Meals followed strict courses, gustatio, appetizers, prima mensa, main dishes, and secunda mensa, desserts. The goal was to display refinement, not gluttony. That didn't stop many from failing spectacularly at it, but the intention was there. A vomitorium, had it existed, would have been an architectural confession that no one had any self-control. And Romans, for all their flaws, valued self-control almost as much as they valued wine. Interestingly, ancient medicine did recommend induced vomiting on occasion, but as therapy, not table etiquette. The physician Celsus, 1st century CE, suggested it to cleanse the body, a sort of early detox, preferably supervised and far away from the dinnerware. It wasn't meant to make room for another helping of stuffed dormouse. The Romans were many things, conquerors, engineers, philosophers, but they weren't running ancient juice cleanses between courses. So why does the myth still survive today? Because it's too perfect. It satisfies our fascination with the grotesque opulence of empires that collapsed under their own appetites. The vomitorium story is less about Rome and more about us, our delight in imagining that the mighty fell not by sword or politics, but by indigestion. It's poetic justice, the idea that empires crumble not from enemies at the gates, but from too much peacock pâté. In reality, the Roman Empire's real vomitorium was metaphorical, a society that consumed endlessly, expanded relentlessly, and eventually collapsed under its own excesses. The exits in their amphitheatres might have spewed forth the crowds, but the empire itself couldn't find an exit from its appetite for domination. So next time someone smugly mentions that Romans had vomitoriums for their feasts, you can correct them, politely of course, and tell them the truth. It wasn't a bathroom. It was a hallway. The ancient world didn't need a special room for overindulgence. Because when you're Rome, the entire empire is the vomitorium. If ancient Rome ate itself in excess, the Byzantine Empire perfected the art of going broke doing it in style. Nowhere was this clearer than in the glittering gold-drenched reign of Emperor Justinian I, a man who believed God had personally endorsed his taste in tableware. His feasts were less about eating, and more about proving that the empire, much like its emperor, was both divine and in serious financial distress. When your dinnerware costs more than your soldiers' armour, you might have a budgeting problem. Byzantium, or Constantinople as it was proudly known, was the beating, glittering heart of the medieval world. A crossroads of east and west, it overflowed with silk, spices, and religious self-importance. The empire's motto might as well have been, "If it's shiny, buy it." And nowhere did that obsession shine brighter than in Justinian's great palace, where feasts weren't mere gatherings, they were heavenly reenactments of paradise, complete with peacocks, gold goblets and an unpaid army. Justinian wasn't born royal. He rose from humble Balkan origins to rule one of the world's richest empires in the 6th century. But he didn't just want to be an emperor. He wanted to be the emperor, the one to outshine Rome, outgod the clergy, and outspend anyone foolish enough to host a dinner party within 100 miles. So when he built Hagia Sophia, the largest church in Christendom, he didn't stop there. He also turned his palace dining hall into a temple of edible opulence. According to court chronicles and later Byzantine historians, the imperial banquets during Justinian's reign were legendary, not for taste but for theatre. Picture it. A hall so massive it echoed with incense and gossip. Columns of Grecian Thessalian marble gleamed under chandeliers lit by hundreds of oil lamps. Gold mosaics shimmered across the ceiling, depicting angels who probably wept at the waist below. Tables stretched endlessly, covered with damask linens, embroidered in thread finer than the emperor's conscience. Each feast began with ceremony. Trumpeters announced the emperor's entrance, eunuchs paraded in carrying dishes like sacred relics, and officials bowed low enough to qualify for chiropractic care. Justinian and his formidable wife, Empress Theodora, sat on gilded thrones at the head of the table, elevated naturally, because nothing says divine ruler like eating your dinner at a higher altitude than your guests. The food, a catalogue of excess: peacock eggs, pheasant pies, roasted cranes, honey-glazed dormice. Yes, the Romans passed down that recipe like a cursed family heirloom. And mountains of imported fruits from Syria, Egypt and beyond. The Byzantines adored spectacle, so dishes weren't just cooked, they were constructed. Whole animals were stuffed into other animals, until the final product resembled culinary Russian nesting dolls. A roasted ox might arrive filled with lamb, stuffed with chicken, packed with quail, and finished with a decorative sprig of "We're all doomed." The utensils themselves were part of the problem. Gold spoons, enamelled knives, silver platters engraved with saints. The empire's treasury might as well have been served alongside the soup. The sheer weight of the servingware probably doubled the workload of every court servant and shaved years off the empire's budget. A Byzantine chronicler once complained that the emperor valued plates more than pay, which is a polite medieval way of saying we're broke, but the fork is fabulous. And then came the entertainment. Dancers, musicians, jugglers, and poets performed between courses, their job being to remind guests that they were in the presence of celestial authority. On special occasions, mechanical birds, crafted from gold and silver, flapped their wings and sang thanks to ingenious water-powered mechanisms. The empire had harnessed early robotics not to defend its borders, but to decorate dessert. Priorities clearly were well aligned. Behind the gilded curtains, however, the empire's finances were bleeding out faster than a drunken senator's dignity. Justinian's wars to reconquer lost Roman territories from Italy to North Africa devoured taxes at an alarming rate. His grand building projects, including the Hagia Sophia, nearly emptied the treasury. And yet the feast continued. To cancel a banquet would have been an admission of weakness, and weakness in Byzantium was more dangerous than starvation. So the emperor threw more dinners, each one a jewel-encrusted promise that everything was fine, even as the empire's accountants quietly passed out. Not everyone was impressed. Procopius, Justinian's court historian, and later his most sarcastic critic, wrote in his secret history that the emperor's luxury masked cruelty and paranoia. To him, the feasts were symbols of Justinian's vanity, elaborate distractions from the fact that half the empire's subjects were bankrupt and the other half were rioting. And he wasn't exaggerating. The Nika riots of 532, sparked by a chariot race and stoked by the resentment of taxes and imperial excess, nearly burned Constantinople to the ground. Thousands died, and while the ashes still smoked, Justinian reportedly sat down to dinner. Nothing says crisis management like carving a roast while your capital burns. Theodora, ever the power behind the throne, turned these feasts into political theatre. She used banquets to reward loyalty, humiliate rivals, and would test foreign ambassadors' manners under pressure. A wrong toast, an incorrect bow, or even looking at the imperial couple for too long could mean exile. Or worse, a lifetime appointment as chief napkin folder of the third rank. Byzantine etiquette was so rigid it made Victorian table manners look like a picnic. But as the empire's wealth drained into gold tableware and endless spectacles, cracks began to show. Lavish hospitality had once symbolized divine blessing. Now it was a public liability. Taxes rose, corruption flourished, and peasants began to mutter that perhaps God didn't dine on peacock after all. Even the clergy grew uneasy at the emperor's culinary pride. One bishop reportedly quipped that Justinian served dinner to angels but left men hungry. By the time Justinian's reign ended in 565, the empire had expanded, yes, but also exhausted itself. His banquets became legends, whispered by future generations as the moment when piety and vanity sat side by side at the same table. Byzantium would endure for centuries yet, but its golden age was already cracking, quite literally, as those gold utensils were eventually melted down to pay soldiers who hadn't seen coin in months. So if you ever find yourself tempted to overspend on dinnerware, remember Emperor Justinian, a man who fed his ego more lavishly than his empire, until even the angels in his mosaics probably rolled their eyes. The good news, the empire sparkled. The bad news, so did the debt. The medieval dining hall might have looked like a scene of abundance. Golden goblets, flickering torches, roasted beasts turning on spits. But underneath all that roasted glory was one lingering question. Will this kill me? Because in the Middle Ages, every royal meal came with a side of suspicion. The good news, the king's dinner was delicious. The bad news was the taster. Poison was the medieval monarch's invisible enemy, and no throne was safe from it. Daggers could be seen, assassins could be caught, but poison? That was treachery with table manners. It was the weapon of choice for those who didn't want to get their hands dirty, or who wanted plausible deniability when the king collapsed into his pudding. And so dining became a deadly gamble, where one bad bite could end not just your appetite, but your dynasty. Fear of poison didn't start in the Middle Ages, but medieval monarchs took it to an art form. They had reason to. Europe's courts were thick with ambition, envy, and unpaid cousins with legitimate claims. A jealous duke didn't need an army. He just needed access to the salt cellar. In the 12th century, Eleanor of Aquitaine's court whispered of secret poisons from the east that could kill without taste or colour. Merchants returning from the Crusades didn't just bring silken spices, they also brought ideas about exotic toxins, feeding Europe's paranoia that every banquet could be a battlefield. Enter the taster, that unsung hero of royal cuisine. Their job description was simple: eat the king's food before he does, and if you're still breathing after 30 seconds, dinner is served. It was arguably the most stressful job in Christendom. Imagine being handed a roasted quail and thinking, this might be my resignation letter. Some tasters were slaves, others loyal knights, and a few even nobles trying to prove devotion through gastrointestinal bravery. None of them retired comfortably. The ritual was elaborate. Before the monarch touched a morsel, servants would parade the dishes in full view of the court. The food was inspected, the cutlery examined, and sometimes even the plates were tested. Wine was poured into silver goblets, believed to change colour in the presence of poison. They didn't, but hope is cheaper than science. Herbs like sage and parsley were sprinkled over dishes not for flavour, but because people thought they absorbed toxins. And tasters? They didn't just nibble, they had to swallow and wait. Nothing says prestige like a 10-minute pause to see if your servant keels over before dessert. Royal paranoia didn't stop at the kitchen door. Monarchs demanded antidotes on standby. Potions, powders, and in some cases, entire laboratories dedicated to alchemical research. One of the most famous antidotes was the theriac, a medieval cure-all that contained more ingredients than a modern pharmacy. It included opium, cinnamon, myrrh, viper flesh, yes, actual snake, and occasionally gold dust, because nothing heals faster than ingesting your currency. Kings took it daily, not because it worked, but because it made them feel invincible. Even tableware became defensive technology. Monarchs commissioned cups carved from unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, believed to neutralize any toxin. Charles the Bold of Burgundy refused to drink from anything else. Others went for bezoar stones, calcified lumps from the stomachs of goats, worn like amulets or dunked into wine as impromptu detoxifiers. There was no evidence these worked, but they did make dinner look impressively paranoid. The kitchens themselves became fortresses. The food supply chain was monitored like military logistics. Royal chefs were locked inside to prevent tampering, and dishes were sealed under wax until served. In France, the royal kitchen had a hierarchy almost as strict as the army. One cook for the meat, another for the bread, and a third just to watch the first two didn't stab each other or the meal. Every loaf of bread, every flagon of ale passed through a bureaucratic obstacle course of inspection. Somewhere between the fear and the paperwork, actual flavour became optional. And yet, despite all precautions, poisoning still happened, or at least people thought they did. The problem was, medieval medicine couldn't tell the difference between illness and intrigue. If a monarch died suddenly, everyone assumed foul play. When King John of England collapsed after a feast in 1216, chroniclers blamed poison, though modern historians suspect dysentery. Same story with Emperor Henry VII, and later Richard of Gloucester's enemies accused him of poisoning his rival's wine. In medieval politics, natural causes were a PR disaster. If your king died peacefully, it made you look careless. Some rulers took the paranoia personally. Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire reportedly tested poison on condemned prisoners just to study symptoms. Spoiler, it worked. Popes, meanwhile, had their own papal tasters, because the only thing holier than dinner with God was not dying during it. In fact, the position of assaggiatore del Papa, papal taster, still exists in the Vatican today, proof that some traditions die harder than others. Poison also became weaponized gossip. Rumours of the poisoned chalice swirled around queens and courtiers alike. Catherine de' Medici, centuries later, would inherit the reputation of a poisoner's patron saint thanks to her Italian background and suspiciously long list of dead enemies. But the roots of that legend sprouted in the Middle Ages, when everyone with a political grudge had a vile-shaped imagination. And let's not forget the psychological toll. Imagine sitting at a table where every clink of cutlery might be your last symphony. Monarchs began to mistrust their closest advisors, their servants, even their families. To dine with the king was an honour, but to cook for him? That was a high-stakes survival game. So next time your meal comes out slightly cold, count your blessings. At least you don't need a servant to eat half your dinner first, a unicorn horn to stir your soup, or a viper-based smoothie as backup. The medieval monarch's banquet might have glittered, but beneath the gold platters was a constant drumbeat of fear. Because in that world, loyalty was rare, science was confused, and ambition came heavily seasoned. The good news, the feast was splendid. The bad news, so was the funeral. If ever there were a royal who could turn dinner into a diplomatic disaster, it was Edward II of England, a man whose feasts were less about food and more about foreshadowing tragedy. In an age when banquets were power statements, Edward's table became a battlefield of ego, betrayal, and very questionable seating arrangements. Nothing ruins a dinner faster than realising your wife and her lover are plotting your replacement. Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, inheriting not only England but also his father's expensive wars and bad temper. Edward, however, was cut from a very different cloth. Perhaps silk, maybe velvet, but definitely not armour. He preferred pageantry to policy, minstrels to ministers, and feast to fighting. While other kings built castles or conquered nations, Edward built a social circle that doubled as a liability. His reign began with a coronation feast that should have been a triumph. A glittering display of medieval pomp meant to dazzle nobles and reassure them that the crown's authority was secure. Instead, it was the culinary equivalent of a diplomatic arson. During this feast, Edward made the spectacularly unwise decision to seat his beloved companion, Piers Gaveston, in a place of honour and right next to him, while the highest-ranking nobles, including his new French queen Isabella, looked on in outrage. To medieval nobles, seating was everything. A misplaced guest was a public insult. An over-promoted favourite was an act of war. By elevating Gaveston above them, Edward might as well have served roast humiliation with gravy. Chroniclers note that the nobles left the table fuming, and Isabella, then a teenage bride, began quietly plotting her revenge before dessert was even cleared. But Gaveston wasn't just a friend, he was Edward's obsession. The two were inseparable, feasting together, hunting together, probably inventing the world's first medieval bromance. Gaveston was handsome, flamboyant, and devastatingly good at making enemies. He mocked the nobility with nicknames that sound like rejected tavern insults. He called the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Arden and mocked others' manners at court. Medieval England wasn't big on humour, especially when it came from the man hogging the king's attention. Edward showered Gaveston with gifts that made his courtiers' blood boil: lands, titles, money, and most galling of all, invitations to royal banquets that should have been reserved for the great lords of the realm. At one notorious feast, Edward had dishes served exclusively to Gaveston, elaborate delicacies, while others dined on simpler fare. It wasn't just favouritism, it was political suicide plated on gold. Eventually the nobles had enough. They banded together under the ordinances of 1311, a polite medieval way of saying, "Get rid of your boyfriend or we'll do it for you." Edward pretended to comply, sent Gaveston away, then promptly invited him back with another feast to celebrate his return from exile. It was the medieval equivalent of announcing your bad decisions with fireworks. The nobles struck back, capturing Gaveston and executing him in 1312. When the news reached Edward, he reportedly refused to eat or speak for days, which, to be fair, was the most effective governance of his reign. But grief soon curdled into rage, and his dinner table turned into a mourning shrine. Gone were the elaborate entertainments. Now his feasts were quiet, brooding affairs, as though the roast venison might whisper, "It's your fault." Into this tense atmosphere entered Queen Isabella, now older, politically sharper, and very done with her husband's incompetence. Their marriage, always cold, turned to open contempt. At dinners, they reportedly sat apart, communicating only through servants. Isabella's patience was stretched thinner than the royal treasury. And then came Edward's new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man who made Gaveston look subtle. Despenser was cruel, greedy, and power-hungry. He monopolised access to the king, confiscated noble estates, and used dinner as an opportunity to flaunt his dominance. Chroniclers say Despenser would insult guests openly, seize the choicest cuts of meat, and even interrupt to correct the king's speech, the medieval equivalent of fact-checking your boss mid-toast. Nobles who dared complain found their lands seized or their relatives imprisoned. The royal table had become a feeding ground for tyranny. Isabella, humiliated and increasingly in danger, fled to France under the guise of diplomacy, and there she met Roger Mortimer, an exiled English noble with charisma, ambition, and excellent timing. Together they formed an alliance, romantic and political, and began plotting to overthrow Edward. While Edward dined in false security back in England, his estranged wife was assembling an army. In 1326, Isabella invaded. Edward, abandoned by his allies, fled desperately from one castle to another, his feasts replaced by hurried meals in draughty halls. The man who once hosted grand banquets was now dining in fear, gnawing on cold bread while rebellion marched toward him. When he was captured, he wasn't killed immediately. The new regime preferred humiliation first. He was imprisoned, stripped of his crown, and, fittingly, denied the luxuries he'd once taken for granted. His last recorded meal, according to chroniclers, was plain: bread, ale, and bitter regret. A far cry from the golden feasts of his youth. A year later, in 1327, he met a brutal end in captivity, the kind of death that history politely avoids describing before supper. In the end, Edward II's downfall wasn't caused by famine or war, but by dinner, or rather by what dinner represented: arrogance, favouritism, and the failure to understand that in a kingdom built on hierarchy, who you fed mattered as much as what you fed them. His table became the mirror of his rule, opulent, tone-deaf, and destined to collapse under the weight of resentment. So if you ever host a dinner party, remember the cautionary tale of Edward II. Keep your favourites modest, your guests equal, and your wife's seat far, far away from her next conspiracy partner. The good news, he dined like a king. The bad news, he died like a lesson. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a dinner party turned into one of the strangest medical mysteries in history, the event that would later be called the Dancing Plague. What began as a bit of post-meal merriment spiralled into mass hysteria as hundreds of people quite literally danced themselves to death. No one could leave the dance floor, mostly because their legs refused to stop. Picture this. It's a warm July evening on the banks of the Rhine. The air smells faintly of bread, beer, and questionable hygiene. Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, was thriving, a bustling medieval city where trade, gossip, and God shared equal billing. And amid this ordinary summer, one woman decided to start dancing. Her name was Frau Trophäa, and she began her solo performance in the street outside her house. No music, no audience, just pure, inexplicable rhythm. At first, her neighbours probably assumed she'd had one too many mugs of ale, or perhaps found religion in a new and exciting form. But as the hours passed and she didn't stop, concern replaced amusement. One day became 2, then 3. By the end of the week, she was joined by dozens of others, all swaying, jerking, and spinning to an invisible tune. Whatever it was, it spread faster than gossip in a royal court. Soon the dancing consumed the city. Eyewitnesses reported streets full of people, men, women, even children, twisting and stamping uncontrollably, drenched in sweat, faces pale, eyes glazed. They danced until their feet bled. They danced until they collapsed, and when they fell, others lifted them up so they could continue. Medieval Europe had seen plagues before, but never one this musical. So how did dinner fit into all this? Because as strange as it sounds, many historians believe the outbreak began during or after a series of communal feasts, festivals held to honour local saints and harvests, where food, drink and prayer all flowed together in glorious chaos. Bread baked with rye, a staple of the region, may have been contaminated with Clavicleps purpurea, a fungus known as ergot, the natural source of LSD-like compounds. In other words, the people of Strasbourg might have thrown the first unintentional rave in history, high on mouldy bread and religious fervour. And what did the city officials do when dozens of citizens began convulsing in rhythm? Naturally, they decided the best solution was more dancing. Believing the plague was a curse that could only be lifted through exhaustion, they hired musicians, built a stage, and ordered the dancers to keep going. It's one of history's most baffling examples of municipal problem-solving. Our citizens are dying from dancing. Excellent, let's add a band. The sound of drums and flutes filled the square as professional entertainers were brought in to assist the afflicted. Bakers donated more bread, priests offered prayers, and somewhere in the chaos, someone probably yelled, "Encore!" Within a month, the number of dancers swelled to around 400. Chroniclers wrote that many died from exhaustion, strokes, or heart failure, collapsing mid-spin as their bodies gave out. One eyewitness said that the streets looked like a battlefield, only the enemy was rhythm. While modern historians have offered many theories, mass psychogenic illness, ergot poisoning, stress-induced mania, the people of the 16th century had simpler explanations: demons, curses, or divine punishment. The region had been battered by famine, disease, and social unrest. Many believed God had simply decided that if humans couldn't behave, he'd make them dance until they begged for mercy. In an age when sin and suffering were thought to go hand in hand, this plague fit the theology perfectly. Part punishment, part exorcism, and entirely bewildering. Religious leaders eventually intervened, ordering the dancers to be transported to the shrine of St. Vitus, the patron saint of dance and nervous disorders, a career specialization only the Middle Ages could invent. Pilgrims carried the exhausted dancers by cart, barefoot and bruised, to the mountain shrine, where priests performed rituals, sprinkled holy water, and forbade further dancing. Slowly, mercifully, the movement faded, but the legend lived on, haunting Europe's collective imagination for centuries. And yet, even after the horror, the event remained strangely festive in cultural memory. Paintings and poems depicted the dance of St. Vitus as both tragedy and dark comedy, a cautionary tale about excess and hysteria. Because while it was terrifying, it was also absurdly human. People had danced at weddings, funerals, coronations, and feasts, but this was the first time dancing became both symptom and spectacle. The elite, naturally, turned it into entertainment. Wealthy patrons hosted their own banquets themed after the plague, mock dancing dinners where guests were encouraged to jig between courses, laughing about the madness of the peasants. Nothing says nobility like turning mass psychosis into dinner theatre. Musicians even composed satirical ballads mocking the cursed dancers, blissfully unaware that poor nutrition, stress, and contaminated grain were probably at the heart of the tragedy. Still, the image of the dancing plague fascinated Europe for generations. Philosophers saw it as divine punishment. Doctors blamed hot blood or bad air. Moralists saw it as proof that laughter and joy must always end in doom. The Renaissance, it seemed, could invent humanism and the printing press, but still couldn't explain why entire towns occasionally waltzed themselves into the grave. Looking back, it's easy to laugh. The idea of an entire city dancing until collapse sounds like a medieval fever dream. But beneath the absurdity lies something deeply human: fear, faith, and the desperate need to find meaning in chaos. In a world where plague, famine, and war struck without warning, maybe dancing was the only form of rebellion left, a way to defy despair. Even if it killed you, the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's strangest dinner-adjacent disasters, a feast gone cosmic, a reminder that sometimes the line between celebration and catastrophe is thinner than a flute's note. The good news: everyone was invited. The bad news: no one could stop. Would you like me to continue next with Chapter 8, Henry VIII's Royal Eating Olympics, keeping the same 700-800 word depth, humour, and historical richness? 8. Henry VIII's Royal Eating Olympics. If there were ever a monarch who could turn dinner into an Olympic event, it was Henry VIII, England's most famously well-fed king. This was not a man who merely ate. He performed consumption with the same gusto he applied to politics, wives, and executions. His table was a battlefield, his appetite a national sport, and his waistline the real royal succession. If calories were crowns, Henry would have ruled the galaxy. By the time Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, the English monarchy was ready for spectacle. The Middle Ages had been all swords and sermons. Now came the Renaissance, an age of display, indulgence, and table manners so complicated they required their own priest. And no one embraced this culinary theatre more enthusiastically than Henry. Food to him wasn't just sustenance, it was proof of divine favour. If the Lord had given him a kingdom, surely he also intended to give him seconds. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court were the engine of this edible empire. Imagine a culinary factory so vast it made modern restaurant chains look modest. At full tilt, over 200 cooks, bakers, and butchers worked daily to produce around 200 meals. Not for the starving poor, of course, but for courtiers, guards, servants, ambassadors, and naturally the royal stomach himself. The kitchen fires never went out, the ovens smoked like dragon mouths, and the scent of roasted meat hung over the Thames like a permanent weather condition. Each feast was a logistical miracle and a moral disaster. Henry's menu read like a zoo's obituary: roasted swans, herons, peacocks, feathers reattached for aesthetic flair, and entire stags stuffed with smaller animals. If it walked, flew, or swam, it was destined for the royal spit. Even the humble chicken couldn't escape experimentation, sometimes baked into pies so elaborately sculpted they looked like cathedral gargoyles. Henry's motto might as well have been, "Why settle for one course when you can have an entire ecosystem?" A typical royal dinner might feature 13 to 20 courses, each accompanied by mountains of bread, puddings, and sugared fruit. Meals began with subtleties, intricate sugar sculptures shaped into scenes of biblical triumphs or political shade. Nothing says God favours me quite like a marzipan recreation of your last military victory. Then came soups, roasts, pies and seafood, including eels, which the Tudors adored for reasons that remain mysterious and unsettling. Dessert brought candied almonds, fruit jellies, and sometimes moulded custards dyed with saffron until they glowed like stained glass. And of course the drinks flowed. The Tudors practically treated hydration as witchcraft. Water was considered dangerous, so the king's goblet was filled with ale, wine, or both. By midday the court was cheerfully inebriated, and by evening diplomacy and digestion were both on shaky ground. Henry himself was known to start his day with ale and end it with claret, a schedule that might explain both his policy decisions and his love of naps. All this indulgence came at a cost. By his 40s, Henry was less fit Renaissance prince and more rolling thunder in velvet. His waistline reportedly expanded to over 50 inches, his legs swelled with gout, and his physicians began issuing politely worded letters about moderation, which he ignored naturally, while ordering another round of venison pasties. Courtiers described him limping through the halls, yet still hosting banquets that lasted hours, punctuated by music, hunting reports, and occasional theological arguments between bites of roasted boar. Gout wasn't just an illness for Henry, it became part of his personal brand. In an era when gluttony was seen as sinful, the king managed to make it look like divine privilege. His swollen ankles were proof he could afford too much meat, sugar, and good wine. The rest of England starved, but the king's knees resembled overcooked puddings, a small price to pay for national morale. The most famous of Henry's feasts wasn't even hosted in England. In 1520 he met the French king, Francis I, near Calais for a diplomatic spectacle known as the Field of Cloth of Gold. Both monarchs tried to outdo each other with food, tents, and sheer nonsense. Henry's tent was made entirely of golden fabric. His cooks served thousands of guests with dishes so rich they required their own accountants. The event cost more than a year of England's tax revenue and achieved absolutely nothing. But by God, it looked magnificent. Henry's approach to dining mirrored his approach to everything else: performative, excessive, and slightly dangerous. His table was a stage where power was displayed in every morsel. Ambassadors were judged by their appetites, nobles by their ability to keep up with the drinking, and queens, well, by their ability to produce heirs and pretend to enjoy it all. His 6 wives endured the royal table as much as his temper. Catherine of Aragon watched her husband's feasts turn from flirtation to frustration. Anne Boleyn tried to bring refinement to the table, but was replaced faster than a stale pie. Jane Seymour's quiet manners suited dinner, though not the king's ambitions. Each queen became part of the royal banquet in metaphor if not menu, consumed, digested, and replaced. By the end of his reign, Henry's feasts had become grim parodies of earlier grandeur. Once he was the Golden Prince of Europe, athletic, handsome, charismatic. Now he was a bloated symbol of excess, dining in isolation, his leg ulcer bandaged, his cooks tiptoeing like priests before a volatile god. Yet even in decline, his appetite never wavered. Chroniclers wrote that when his body failed, his hunger did not. Food remained his one unwavering kingdom. Historians sometimes call him a tyrant, others a visionary, but perhaps the most honest description is this. Henry VIII was a man who mistook appetite for destiny. His banquets were not just meals, they were monuments, edible cathedrals to his ego, his insecurity, and his endless need to consume everything he could not control. The good news, he never went hungry. The bad news, neither did history. In the summer of 1520, the kings of England and France decided to do what powerful men throughout history have always done when their egos collided. Throw an outrageously expensive party and pretend it was about peace. The result was the Field of Cloth of Gold, a 2-week diplomatic summit so absurdly extravagant that it bankrupted treasuries, bruised reputations, and accomplished absolutely nothing except proving that the Renaissance elite could outspend common sense. It was less meeting of nations, a more flexing contest with cutlery. The event took place between June 7 and June 24th in a peaceful meadow near Calais, technically English soil though uncomfortably close to France, like a polite but passive-aggressive handshake. On one side was King Henry VIII of England, at the peak of his golden youth, muscular, handsome, dripping with ambition, and recently addicted to the idea that diplomacy could be conducted through display. On the other stood King Francis I of France, equally young, equally glamorous, and every bit as convinced that the universe revolved around him. Between them lay decades of rivalry, an entire field of tents, and an ocean of wine. The goal was simple enough, at least on paper. Both kings, guided by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's famously scheming advisor, sought to cement peace between their two nations. Wolsey envisioned it as a triumph of European unity. In reality, it became a royal fashion show on steroids. From the moment the planning began, subtlety died a quiet death. Each monarch wanted to outshine the other, so peaceful meeting quickly escalated into architectural arms race. The tents alone were works of madness. Henry's pavilion was so enormous that it looked like a temporary palace, made of gold-threaded fabric and complete with glass windows, in a tent. The French, not to be outdone, constructed entire villages out of silk, velvet and imported tapestries. Every inch of the field shimmered, giving the event its legendary name, Le Camp du Drap d'Or, or the Field of Cloth of Gold. It looked less like a peace conference and more like a Renaissance Coachella sponsored by God himself. Henry brought 5,000 attendants, Francis roughly the same, and together they turned the meadow into the world's most expensive picnic. Between them stood fountains, not of water, but of wine and ale, because nothing says diplomacy like drunken nobles arguing about table placement. Servants scurried around carrying trays of roast swans, peacocks, venison pies, and exotic fruits that had travelled farther than most of the guests. Even the tablecloths were embroidered with gold thread, because linen was apparently for peasants. The feasting schedule was relentless. Every day featured banquets, jousts, masquerades, and musical performances, all meant to demonstrate refinement, power, and the sheer ability to burn money faster than the Reformation could spread. The kings dined together in public displays of supposed fraternity, offering toasts, trading compliments, and pretending not to loathe each other. Henry, eager to impress, arrived in full splendour, wearing jewels that could blind a bishop. Francis, ever the charmer, countered with wit, charm, and a wardrobe that whispered, "I invented style." The food was almost comically excessive. Chroniclers described enormous pies stuffed with smaller pies, entire boars roasted with fruit in their mouths, and towers of sugared confections sculpted into mythological scenes. One even depicted Hercules, probably because both monarchs secretly fancied themselves as him. The drink flowed like diplomacy should have, endlessly and without restraint. Every toast was a competition in volume and flair. The word cheers probably entered early retirement that summer. But beneath the laughter and the lute music, the event was nothing short of a political staring contest. Both monarchs watched each other's every move, who bowed first, who arrived last, who gave the bigger gift. Henry's musicians were ordered to play louder than Francis's. Francis's jousters were instructed to accidentally outshine the English ones. The line between diplomacy and theatrical pettiness blurred completely. Then came the wrestling match. Yes, a wrestling match. Because apparently, after enough wine and flattery, two kings decided that the best way to cement peace was to suplex each other. Francis, lighter and more agile, reportedly threw Henry to the ground in front of the entire court. Accounts differ on whether Henry laughed it off or sulked for days, but one thing is certain, the English delegation's collective ego had just pulled a muscle. Wolsey, watching his carefully constructed alliance turn into a royal brawl, must have aged a decade that day. He had envisioned the event as a triumph of European harmony. Instead, he got two monarchs treating international relations like a Tudor version of keeping up with the Kingsmen. Despite the excess, or perhaps because of it, nothing substantial was achieved. No treaty of lasting importance, no alliance that outlived the hangover. Within 2 years, Henry and Francis were at war again, both having concluded that it was cheaper to fight each other than to keep paying for all that imported silk. The Peace Summit ended up as a historical footnote, notable mainly for proving that Renaissance diplomacy was indistinguishable from competitive pageantry. But if the event was politically useless, it was visually unforgettable. Eyewitnesses described the field gleaming so brightly under the sun that it looked like a mirage of heaven. Painters immortalized it as the pinnacle of courtly magnificence. And for the common folk who glimpsed the spectacle from afar, it was a rare window into a world of surreal abundance, a reminder that while they toiled for bread, kings were busy inventing haute cuisine and diplomatic vanity projects. Henry left France heavier, poorer and slightly bruised in body and pride. Francis left equally broke but smug, having bested the English king both on the field and at the banquet table. The field of cloth of gold became a legend not for peace, but for proving that nothing bankrupts nations faster than the need to look fabulous. In the end, the only real winner was the tailor. The good news, Europe got a feast for the ages. The bad news, it came with a hangover that lasted centuries. In Renaissance Italy, dinner wasn't merely dinner. It was diplomacy disguised as digestion. A nightly performance where alliances were toasted, enemies were flattered, and the slightest wrong sip could become your obituary. Among the powerhouses of that perilous stage, none played the culinary chess game quite like the Medici and the Borgia families. Their feasts were legendary for opulence, politics, and the occasional fatal seasoning. Dessert was delicious, if you didn't mind your internal organs auditioning for an escape act. Let's start with the Medici of Florence, the original bankers to God, whose fortune and cunning built an empire out of velvet and vengeance. They patronised artists, financed popes, and ruled with the polished subtlety of people who could make a loan and an enemy in the same handshake. To dine with them was to step into a painting by Botticelli, if Botticelli had secretly specialised in deadly ambition. Gold platters gleamed, fountains burbled wine, and the food, spiced, imported, and absurdly elaborate, carried as much meaning as it did flavour. Every detail was political. Who sat closest to Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, mattered as much as what you were served. A seat near the patriarch signalled trust, a seat near the door signalled that you should maybe start running. The dishes themselves were coded messages. A roast peacock, wealth, a pie filled with songbirds, power over nature, a sugared orange from Sicily, influence that stretched across the sea. And if the host raised his cup toward you, you smiled, bowed slightly, and prayed that the wine didn't taste too almondy. Because almonds, as everyone knew, were the signature scent of arsenic, the Renaissance's most fashionable form of problem-solving. Nowhere was this culinary paranoia more pronounced than in the shadowy rivalry between the Medici and the Borgias. If the Medicis were Florence's velvet-gloved puppeteers, the Borgias were Rome's barbed-wire diplomats, ruthless, brilliant, and utterly unburdened by ethics. Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI, turned Vatican dinners into high-stakes feasts of power. His daughter, the infamous Lucrezia Borgia, was rumoured, though probably unfairly, to carry a hollow ring filled with poison, ready to season inconvenient guests. The truth is murkier than the wine they poured. Renaissance Italy was obsessed with poison, not just as murder but as art. Apothecaries in Florence and Venice openly sold powders and potions under the polite label aqua tofana or inheritance powder. Some came from arsenic trioxide, others from belladonna or hemlock, and all of them could slip invisibly into your stew. The poisoner's craft was admired the way modern society admires hackers, feared but quietly respected for their innovation. One of the most infamous dinners took place in the late 1400s, when the Borgias allegedly hosted several high-ranking cardinals who had outlived their usefulness. The tale goes that they served poisoned wine intended for their enemies, only for the plan to backfire when the wrong bottles were placed before the Pope and his son Cesare. Accounts differ, but several chroniclers claimed Rodrigo Borgia fell violently ill soon after and died in agony, while Cesare barely survived. If true, it was the Renaissance equivalent of sending yourself a poisoned email. Meanwhile, back in Florence, the Medici were perfecting the art of culinary politics without quite so much spillage. Catherine de' Medici, Lorenzo's descendant, carried her family's flair for theatrical dining to France when she married King Henry II. She brought with her chefs, recipes, and a reputation for subtle danger. French courtiers whispered that she'd introduce poison to Paris along with pastry cream, which, to be fair, are both equally deadly in the right quantities. Catherine's elegant banquets blended sophistication with suspicion. Her guests marvelled at her innovation, forks, fine china, delicate sauces, and discreetly checked their goblets before each sip. Poison had become the ultimate social equalizer. It made kings tremble and servants indispensable. It was the invisible guest at every banquet, the silent third course no one ordered, but everyone feared. Physicians began publishing treatises on antidotes. Courtiers collected charms against toxins, wearing bezoar stones or unicorn horn cups, which, in reality, were narwhal tusks with fantastic markups. Entire industries blossomed around not dying at dinner. But the fascination wasn't just practical, it was aesthetic. Renaissance art celebrated the theme of death disguised as beauty. Just as a perfectly baked tart could conceal venom, a smiling hostess could conceal treachery. Banquets were metaphors for politics, outwardly civilized, inwardly lethal. Even Machiavelli, who attended his share of Medici feasts, wrote in The Prince about the necessity of deceit served with charm. If Florence had an official motto, it might have been "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow someone might taste your soup first." Despite all the sinister stories, both families managed to survive their own culinary minefields. Mostly. The Medici outlasted the Borgias, rising to ducal and papal power, while the Borgia name became a byword for scandal. Yet both left behind the same legacy, a world where the dinner table was indistinguishable from the throne room, and the kitchen was a political weapon. The paranoia even outlived them. Centuries later, when Cosmo III de' Medici reigned in the 1600s, his court still employed professional tasters, apothecaries and culinary inspectors, men who spent their lives staring suspiciously at soup. The family that had bankrolled the Renaissance now lived in fear of its own menu. Modern historians debate how many of these poisonings were real and how many were products of rumour, propaganda or melodrama. But in Renaissance Italy, the truth didn't matter nearly as much as the possibility. To accuse your rival of poisoning was to tarnish them forever, and to survive a rumoured attempt was to prove divine favour. So yes, dessert in Florence or Rome might have been exquisite, fragrant and beautifully plated, but behind every pastry chef stood a priest, a taster and a poet ready to eulogise whoever didn't make it to morning. The good news, the pudding was heavenly. The bad news, so was the afterlife. When Louis XIV of France declared "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, he wasn't exaggerating. He was the state, and judging by the size of his dinners, possibly the state's entire agricultural output. Few monarchs ever made eating a matter of national theatre quite like the Sun King, who transformed meals into political performances, where every bite gleamed with meaning, ego and gravy. Imagine eating breakfast while 50 people applaud your chewing. Louis XIV ruled France for 72 years, long enough to perfect the art of royal spectacle. He built Versailles not as a home but as a solar system, with himself as the blinding centre, and the orbit of courtiers, ministers and nobles revolved around him, like desperate planets seeking warmth, approval, and a decent slice of pheasant pie. At Versailles, even digestion was divine business. The daily royal dinner, known as the Grand Couvert, was not a private meal but a full-blown public event. It took place in the Hall of Mirrors or the King's Bedchamber, depending on the occasion, under a chandelier's blaze and the judgmental eyes of the aristocracy. Hundreds of courtiers were invited to watch the king eat. Not dine with him, that would have been too familiar, but simply stand, observe, and admire. It was the world's most awkward cooking show, except the host was God's chosen representative on earth. Picture the scene, trumpets blaring, guards saluting, doors opening in a synchronized flourish. The king, resplendent in gold embroidery, enters slowly, followed by a small army of servants. The room falls into reverent silence as he sits. Plates are presented with ceremonial precision. No one speaks unless spoken to. The courtiers lean forward, fascinated by every gesture. When he raises his spoon, 50 fans flutter. When he chews, people nod approvingly. When he swallows, it's practically state policy. The irony is that Louis often wasn't a particularly dainty eater. Chroniclers note that he had the appetite of a man who believed calories couldn't touch royalty. His typical dinner included 4 soups, 2 entire chickens, a pheasant, a slice of ham, salad, mutton, pastry, fruit, and a staggering number of eggs, sometimes up to 12. It was less meal and more culinary conquest. But this was France, and presentation mattered as much as consumption. Each dish arrived in elaborate succession, flanked by silver platters, flanked again by servants whose job was to stand perfectly still while the king decided whether he was in the mood for quail or national bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the orchestra, yes, an orchestra, played soft courtly music as the sovereign dined. Nothing stimulates digestion quite like a live harpsichord. Why this public spectacle? Control. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a political machine powered by flattery and exhaustion. By turning meals into performances, Louis XIV reminded everyone who ruled both table and throne. Nobles who had once rebelled against royal authority now fought for the honour of handing him a napkin. Etiquette manuals from the period listed over 100 rules for dining in the king's presence, including when to approach, how to bow, and which direction to look while the monarch chewed. Spoiler, never directly at the mouth. Of course, the king didn't dine alone in spirit. His court revolved around him in concentric circles of privilege. The highest-ranking nobles could stand closest. Others were banished to the edges of the room, watching from afar like envious extras. A lucky few, often royal relatives or mistresses, were permitted to sit, though even they had to remain silent unless addressed. Imagine being invited to the world's most exclusive dinner only to be told your role was decorative. Versailles dining wasn't just about food, it was about performance, excess, and control. Every bite symbolised the king's divine right to consume not only France's finest delicacies, but France itself. Even the ingredients were a geopolitical statement. Sugar came from colonies, wine from Burgundy, game from royal forests, each dish a miniature map of French domination. And yet, behind the golden ceremony, there were cracks. The kitchen of Versailles was an empire of its own. Hundreds of cooks, bakers and butchers, all sweating in infernal conditions. The food, by the time it reached the king, was often lukewarm. Dishes were carried across vast galleries and staircases, jostled by servants while musicians played fanfares and nobles practiced reverence. By the time the soup arrived, it was as cold as courtly sincerity, but that didn't matter, because no one dared mention it. Louis's appetite became legendary, but so did his digestion problems. Late in life, he suffered from gout, rotting teeth, and a stomach so temperamental that his physicians became as essential as his cooks. He refused to slow down. One eyewitness noted that the king eats as if he fears famine. Perhaps he did. The fear of scarcity haunted even the richest monarch in Europe. While peasants starved across France, the Sun King dined under chandeliers made of their taxes. It wasn't all solemnity, though. The king loved spectacle and occasionally spiced dinner with theatre. Masquerades, musical interludes and allegorical pageants filled the gaps between courses. Once, dessert was served in a mechanical ship that glided across the table. Another time, the servants presented a roast swan that burst into flame, intentionally. The Sun King liked a bit of pyrotechnic flair with his poultry. The courtiers, meanwhile, lived in a constant state of competitive starvation. The cost of keeping up appearances, new gowns, powdered wigs, bribes for seating privileges, left many bankrupt. Versailles was a glittering cage where ambition fed on crumbs and vanity was the main course. They applauded the king's appetite because it symbolized their dependence on him. In a way, the Grand Couvert was the perfect metaphor for France itself, one man eating while the rest of the nation watched. When Louis XIV finally died in 1715, France collectively sighed, some with grief, others with relief. His body, embalmed and paraded through Paris, reminded everyone of what excess looked like when it stopped moving. The Sun King had consumed everything, wealth, admiration, time itself, until nothing was left but debt and indigestion. Still, the image of him dining under the golden light endures, elegant, proud, theatrical, unstoppable. He turned eating into an act of statecraft, his stomach a symbol of monarchy, his fork a sceptre. The good news, he never lost his appetite. The bad news, neither did Versailles. Few phrases in history have managed to outlive their original speaker, quite like "let them eat cake." It's been quoted, misquoted, and tattooed onto the collective memory of France as the ultimate example of royal cluelessness. But here's the catch. Marie Antoinette never said it. Not once. Not even in a moment of champagne-fueled flippancy. Yet the phrase became her immortal crime, the soundbite that crowned her the poster child for aristocratic detachment. She didn't say "let them eat cake," but she did live like her bakery had diplomatic immunity. The line first appeared long before Marie Antoinette was even old enough to complain about stale croissants. It comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written in the 1760s, when the young Austrian archduchess hadn't even arrived in France. Rousseau attributes the remark to a great princess, who upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, supposedly replied, "Let them eat brioche." It was an anecdote meant to illustrate the callousness of the ruling class in general, not a specific person. But after the Revolution, when propaganda needed a villain, Marie Antoinette fit the role perfectly, and the words stuck to her name like icing on a royal pastry. The real Marie Antoinette was guilty not of saying it, but of embodying everything the phrase represented: luxury, isolation, and the kind of aristocratic obliviousness that comes from living in a palace so big it could have its own postal code. By the time she married Louis XVI and moved into Versailles, France was already teetering on the brink of financial collapse. The treasury was drained by wars, the peasants were starving, and the royal court responded by throwing more dinner parties. At Versailles, every meal was the theatre, and Marie Antoinette's dining habits became part of the national mythology of excess. The Queen dined under chandeliers so vast they could light small villages, served by servants so numerous they could form a small army. A typical evening meal involved dozens of dishes, soups, roasts, pastries, and delicacies imported from every corner of Europe. The silverware alone was worth more than most farms, And to the starving public outside the gilded gates, it wasn't just food. It was proof that their rulers lived on a different planet. But here's the irony. Marie Antoinette wasn't particularly gluttonous. If anything, she preferred lighter meals and delicate sweets. Her real sin was presentation. She had an almost obsessive love for refinement. Every plate had to match the porcelain, every dessert arranged like edible jewellery. Her kitchens employed the greatest chefs of the age, including Marie-Antoine Carême, who turned sugar and flour into art. At her table, pastry was propaganda, proof that the monarchy embodied grace, elegance, and God-given superiority. When she grew tired of court formalities, she escaped to her personal retreat, the Petit Trianon, a miniature palace on the Versailles grounds where she could live simply. Of course, her idea of simplicity involved imported marble bathtubs, hand-fed sheep wearing ribbons, and elaborate picnics served on porcelain. She would host rustic-themed feasts dressed as a shepherdess, surrounded by dairymaids who were in fact noblewomen in disguise. Nothing says I understand the people quite like pretending to milk a cow next to a manicurist. Meanwhile, outside those manicured gardens, France's real peasants faced bread shortages so severe that riots erupted across the countryside. Bread wasn't just food, it was life. A working-class family might spend up to half their income on it, and when bad harvests drove prices higher, desperation spread like wildfire. By the late 1780s, the average Parisian was eating less than a quarter of the bread they needed to survive. The phrase, "let them eat cake," whether spoken or not, symbolised the cosmic distance between the glittering court and the hungry masses clawing for crumbs. As famine deepened, Versailles remained oblivious. The royal menus stayed sumptuous, and Marie Antoinette's spending habits became a national scandal. The infamous diamond necklace affair, in which she was falsely accused of purchasing a necklace worth millions, sealed her public image as a woman who would bankrupt a nation for accessories. Revolutionaries and pamphleteers feasted on her reputation, depicting her as Madame Deficit, a woman who devoured France's future between sips of champagne. The truth was more complicated. Marie Antoinette wasn't cruel, just catastrophically insulated. Raised in a world where appearances mattered more than empathy, she never learned how to perform humility. When she donated to charity, the gesture was seen as smug. When she hosted banquets, they were seen as insults. She was, in essence, the last queen of a dying script, still delivering her lines as the theatre burned down around her. When the revolution finally came, her dining habits were used against her in propaganda. Revolutionary cartoons depicted her with an enormous mouth devouring loaves of bread, or sitting atop mountains of pastries while emaciated peasants begged below. The phrase "let them eat cake" became shorthand for everything wrong with monarchy. Indifference, decadence, and disconnection. It didn't matter whether she said it. It felt true. Even after her arrest and imprisonment, the obsession with her eating continued. During her captivity in the Temple prison, guards reportedly mocked her by serving her lavish meals she could no longer enjoy. When she was finally led to the guillotine in 1793, her last recorded act was not a royal speech but an apology. She accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot. For once, her words were humble and tragically human. In the centuries since, historians have tried to rehabilitate her image, pointing out that she never uttered the famous line, that she donated to orphanages, that she was at heart a victim of circumstance. But myths are hungrier than facts. Let them eat cake has survived because it captures something timeless about power. How easy it is to mistake privilege for virtue and luxury for legitimacy. So no, Marie Antoinette didn't say it. She didn't need to. Her world said it for her. Every banquet, every gown, every chandelier that sparkled while Paris starved. The good news? The cake was metaphorical. The bad news? The revolution wasn't. If most monarchs used the dinner table to display refinement, Peter the Great of Russia used it to declare war on human restraint. His banquets weren't meals. They were endurance tests disguised as diplomacy. Wine flowed like rivers, vodka was treated like water, and if you left the party conscious, You clearly hadn't respected the Tsar enough. Peter the First, who ruled Russia from 1682 to 1725, was a man on a mission to drag his vast, unruly empire into the modern world, preferably by its beard. He built cities, reorganized armies, and ordered courtiers to shave, learn etiquette, and stop behaving like medieval warlords. But for all his reformist zeal, Peter's approach to Western sophistication was interpretive. He admired European science, art and engineering, and somehow concluded that binge drinking counted as cultural progress. At the heart of Peter's peculiar social engineering was the royal feast, a nightly spectacle that made Versailles look like a spa retreat. His banquets blurred the line between celebration and survival training. The Tsar hosted gatherings that lasted not hours but days. Guests, nobles, diplomats, or the occasional unfortunate foreign envoy were expected to match him drink for drink, toast for toast, until reason, dignity, and the ability to stand had entirely vacated the premises. These feasts were not mere revelry, they were tests of loyalty. To drink with Peter was to prove devotion to the state, to hesitate was treason by teacup. The Tsar drank with terrifying enthusiasm, reportedly capable of downing several litres of strong wine or brandy in one sitting. He loved watching others crumble before him. Slurring nobles, collapsed ambassadors, even terrified clergy, all reduced to equal status under the table. This was Peter's version of democracy. Everyone crawled home. His most notorious invention was the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, an official drinking club masquerading as a parody of the church. Members wore clerical robes, mock-baptized each other in vodka, and held holy feasts where wine replaced sacrament and blasphemy replaced grace. Peter himself took the title of Prince Pope, presiding over his drunken congregation like a gleeful heretic. Guests were forced to make toasts so elaborate they bordered on performance art, to the health of Russia, to the Tsar's moustache, to the good fortune of the royal dogs. Refusing a toast was an insult. Refusing another round was suicidal. These were not Priaphet affairs either. Foreign ambassadors were frequently invited, or more accurately drafted, into this nightly madness. Accounts from terrified Western envoys describe tables groaning under entire roasted oxen, mountains of salted fish, pyramids of bread, and oceans of alcohol. Dishes were served in overwhelming succession, each one greasier, richer, and deadlier to digestion than the last. The Tsar's appetite for both food and spectacle was legendary. Once, he reportedly commanded that a giant pie be baked large enough to conceal a live dwarf, who popped out mid-dinner to recite a toast. Europe had diplomacy, Russia had dinner theatre. Surviving Peter's feast required skill, strategy, and an iron liver. The Tsar personally monitored who was drinking and who was cheating. To fake a sip was an act of heresy. Guests developed clever survival techniques, sipping water from their wine cups, pretending to faint early, or deliberately spilling drinks when Peter wasn't looking. Unfortunately, Peter was looking. He once ordered a servant caught hiding behind a curtain to be dragged back, revived with cold water, and forced to finish his vodka ration. The man survived, physically, if not spiritually. By the early 1700s, the Tsar's banquets had become notorious across Europe. Diplomats from Sweden and the Dutch Republic wrote horrified letters home describing a nation intoxicated in the name of progress. But to Peter, these wild dinners symbolized the new Russia he was building, one that rejected old religious solemnity for modern civilization. Civilization apparently meant vomiting into silver basins while the Tsar laughed. The after effects were predictable. Chronic hangovers were considered a badge of honor. One foreign officer stationed in St. Petersburg noted that men of rank are expected to die of apoplexy before 40. Peter's own health began to deteriorate under the weight of his excess. He suffered chronic digestive pain, the royal stomachache, as his doctors delicately put it, and violent fevers likely caused by ulcers and overwork. His physicians begged him to moderate his drinking, Peter responded by promoting them to toasts at dinner. Despite his personal chaos, Peter's feast served a purpose. They reinforced his image as a man of the people, a ruler who drank with soldiers, joked with commoners, and despised the stuffy rituals of traditional nobility. He once shocked courtiers by inviting peasants to dine beside him, declaring, "A loyal heart is worth more than a noble title." The peasants were flattered. The nobles were horrified. The tablecloths never recovered. There was also a darker side. Peter's merriment could turn violent. He enjoyed cruel pranks, shaving drunk guests' heads while they slept, or forcing them to dance until they collapsed. At one feast, he even ordered a nobleman who had refused to drink to be drenched in brandy and set on fire. Mercifully, someone intervened. For Peter, excess was power. To force others to partake, to humiliate them through pleasure, was proof of his absolute control. When Peter finally died in 1725, his liver no doubt sighed in relief. His death was said to be brought on by a bladder infection, but chronic alcohol abuse and digestive failure surely played their part. Russia had modernized under him. Its navy built, its sciences expanded, its capital moved to St. Petersburg, but his legacy remained as paradoxical as his parties, brilliant, brutal, and always a little drunk. For all its barbaric splendour, the Tsar's dinner table was a microcosm of his empire, chaotic, glorious, and perpetually teetering between genius and hangover. His feasts weren't about indulgence, they were about domination. He didn't just want loyalty, he wanted to watch you prove it, preferably by collapsing face first into your soup. The good news, the Tsar loved a good toast. The bad news, you were usually the one being toasted. If history has taught the monarchs anything, it's this. Never throw a party when your empire is one bad decision away from collapse. Unfortunately for Tsar Nicholas II, that particular lesson arrived about a century too late. In May 1806, the newly crowned Emperor of all Russia celebrated his coronation with a grand feast, one so lavish, so well-intentioned, and so catastrophically organised that it turned into a national tragedy. When your coronation party has a higher body count than your wars, maybe tone down the hospitality. Nicholas II had just ascended to the throne after the death of his father Alexander III, a man built like a locomotive and twice as intimidating. The young Nicholas was, by comparison, polite, soft-spoken, and spectacularly unprepared to rule the world's largest empire. Still, Russia loved a coronation, and Moscow prepared to outshine anything Europe had ever seen. For 2 weeks, the city transformed into a kaleidoscope of gold, banners, and imperial pomp. There were parades, fireworks, religious processions, and, most importantly, a free public feast to thank the people for their loyalty. What could possibly go wrong? The site chosen for this grand gesture was Kodinka Field, a flat expanse on the edge of Moscow that had recently been used for military exercises, which meant it was pitted with trenches, holes, and debris. But the planners, perhaps in a vodka-fueled moment of optimism, decided it was perfect for hosting 500,000 people. The coronation committee promised that every citizen who came would receive a free meal, a commemorative mug, a sausage, a bread roll, a piece of cheese, and, most excitingly, a cup of beer. For Russia's working class, who often couldn't afford such luxuries, this was more than generosity. It was manna from the Tsar. The night before the feast, crowds began arriving early to secure their place. By dawn, an estimated 700,000 people had gathered. Imagine a field the size of several football stadiums, crammed shoulder to shoulder with men, women, and children, hungry, restless, and increasingly convinced that there wouldn't be enough food for everyone. Rumours began to spread. The beer was running out, the mugs were limited, the sausage was gone. The murmur of excitement turned into panic, and panic turned into stampede. When the distribution finally began, chaos erupted. People surged forward, tripping over holes and collapsing under the crush. Police and soldiers tried to maintain order. but it was like shouting at a tidal wave. In the confusion, thousands fell, unable to stand or breathe. By the time the crowd finally dispersed, over 300 people were dead and nearly 100 injured, trampled in a disaster so horrific that even the Tsarist censors couldn't hide it. Moscow's festive air curdled into shock. The coronation that was supposed to unite the people had instead crushed them. And yet, the real scandal wasn't just the tragedy, it was what happened after. That very evening, Nicholas II and his wife, Empress Alexandra, attended a glittering ball at the French embassy. The city was still identifying the bodies when the imperial couple swept into the ballroom under chandeliers, greeted by the elite of Europe. Diplomats danced, orchestras played, champagne flowed. The Tsar smiled politely. To be fair, Nicholas was reportedly horrified by the tragedy and briefly considered cancelling his appearance. But his advisers warned him that snubbing the French ambassador, and by extension Russia's crucial ally, would be a diplomatic disaster. And so the young emperor did what he would do for the rest of his reign. Nothing decisive. He went to dinner. Newspapers the next day captured the contrast in excruciating detail. On one side of the city, peasants mourned their dead, mothers searching for lost children among piles of broken mugs and trampled bread. On the other, the Tsar waltzed beneath crystal chandeliers, his boots polished so brightly that they could have reflected the guilt he refused to feel. The event quickly became known as the Kudinka tragedy, and Nicholas earned his first unflattering nickname, Nicholas the Bloody. It was not a great start. The symbolism was impossible to miss. To the people, Kudinka wasn't just an accident, it was an omen. The Tsar had promised bread and beer, and delivered corpses and silence. The incident exposed a deeper rot in the empire's foundations, an autocracy so insulated that it couldn't tell celebration from catastrophe. Even foreign observers were appalled. A British correspondent wrote that the coronation began with piety and ended in a beer riot. The French ambassador, perhaps sensing the awkwardness of hosting a party on the night of a massacre, declared the ball a necessity of state. A necessity of bad taste, perhaps. For Nicholas, the event marked the beginning of a lifelong pattern, good intentions smothered by the indecision. He issued statements of sorrow, paid for funerals and ordered donations to the victims' families, but it was too late. The myth of the benevolent Tsar died that day, trampled alongside the peasants who had once believed in it. In the decades that followed, as famine, war and revolution tore through Russia, Kudinka became shorthand for everything wrong with his reign, a symbol of disconnect between ruler and ruled, luxury and poverty, promise and reality. In private, Nicholas reportedly confessed that Kudinka left a shadow over the coronation. That shadow never lifted. His empire would stumble from crisis to crisis, Bloody Sunday, the Man O' Five Revolution, World War I, until it finally imploded in 1917, when he and his family were executed the following year. Many Russians whispered grimly that their fate had been sealed not in a palace, but on that field of crushed bodies and spilled beer. Even today, Kudinka Field stands as a memorial to imperial blindness, a reminder that no dynasty, however divine it thinks itself, can survive on empty promises and overcooked sausages. The coronation feast of 1896 was meant to celebrate the unity of the Russian people. Instead, it proved that the empire had already lost touch with them. It was the banquet that foretold a revolution, served cold with a side of irony. The good news? The people got free beer. The bad news? It was the last toast of an empire. Few monarchs in history could make dinner sound like a life-threatening event, quite like Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburg dynasties. His reign was less a tale of grandeur and conquest than one long, wheezing epilogue to royal genetics. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, partly because his subjects suspected sorcery, and partly because it was too awkward to say our king's chromosomes are filing for divorce. When your family tree is a circle, even dinner digestion becomes a royal challenge. Charles II was born in 1661, the product of 2 centuries of inbreeding so enthusiastic it could have qualified as a family hobby. The Habsburgs had been intermarrying for generations to keep power pure, resulting in a gene pool so shallow you could wade through it in silk slippers. By the time Charles arrived, nature had given up and simply mailed in a warning label. He was physically frail, mentally unstable, and suffered from a range of illnesses that modern historians politely describe as complex. Eating for Charles was less a pleasure than a daily negotiation with mortality. At his court in Madrid, the royal table was both magnificent and macabre. The Spanish court of the 17th century clung to a style of etiquette so rigid it made Versailles look like a tavern. Meals were silent, ritualized, and heavily religious. Dishes arrived in solemn procession, golden platters of game, pheasant, and sweet pastries, flanked by candles and crucifixes. Servants crossed themselves before serving, as if delivering sacraments instead of supper. But behind the pomp lay a tragic secret. The king's body couldn't handle most of it. Charles's health was a national obsession. From the moment he could chew, physicians hovered like crows, offering tonics, powders, and occasionally exorcisms. His stomach rebelled against almost everything he ate. Chronic indigestion, vomiting, and fevers plagued him throughout his life. His face was pale, his tongue swollen, and his jaw so deformed by the infamous Habsburg chin that chewing solid food required both patience and faith. He had to be spoon-fed well into adulthood, a sight that horrified foreign ambassadors and quietly terrified his courtiers. Spain, once the mightiest empire on earth, was now ruled by a man who couldn't finish dinner without medical supervision. Still, royal etiquette demanded appearances. The king was expected to preside over grand banquets, even if he could barely taste the food. Feasts stretched for hours, elaborate performances of wealth and faith, where silver plates gleamed under candlelight while Charles stared blankly at his soup, struggling to keep it down. Courtiers praised the meals, toasted his health, and ignored the fact that the monarch was sweating through his velvet doublet before dessert. Every spoonful was political theatre, a show of vitality in a body that refused to cooperate. To make matters worse, Spanish medical theory at the time was a dizzying blend of mysticism and trial and error. Court physicians prescribed cleansing diets that alternated between fasting, bloodletting, and drinking concoctions that might as well have been invented by Satan's pharmacist. One remedy involved powdered human skull mixed into wine, presumably to add both calcium and existential horror. Another involved mercury, a substance that made the king's tremors worse and his temper worse still. When all else failed, the blame shifted from biology to witchcraft. Convinced that natural explanations were too ordinary, the Spanish court launched a full-blown supernatural investigation. Exorcists were summoned, priests performed rituals over his meals, and one particularly ambitious friar claimed to have found evidence that demons were disturbing His Majesty's digestion. In fairness, the food probably did that on its own. For weeks they sprinkled holy water over his soup, recited prayers between courses, and monitored his stools for signs of spiritual warfare. Meanwhile, Charles's dinner table became a grim metaphor for his empire. Once, Spain had dined on the riches of the New World, silver, sugar, and spices pouring into its ports. But by the late 1800s, the glory had soured. The treasury was empty, the colonies restless, and the aristocracy bloated with privilege and lethargy. As the empire decayed, so did its monarch, frail, confused, and increasingly haunted by omens. Foreign ambassadors sent back reports that bordered on tragic comedy. One French envoy wrote that the king eats little and prays much, while another noted that he does not speak, except to bless his food. Rumours spread that he could see ghosts, that he slept among relics, that he kept the bones of saints beside his bed for company. The man who ruled the world's richest territories couldn't manage a functioning digestive tract, and his courtiers, terrified of offending him, pretended this was perfectly fine. By the 1690s, Charles's health collapsed entirely. He was skeletal, nearly blind, and suffered seizures that left him unable to walk unaided. Yet still, the ceremonies continued. He was carried to meals, propped up in his chair, and fed soft foods like puddings and stewed fruit, the diet of a man decades older. Chroniclers describe a particularly grim feast in 1699 when the king fainted mid-meal, was revived and insisted on continuing to eat. "It is my duty," he reportedly whispered, a line that could serve as the epitaph for both his stomach and his dynasty. When he finally died in 1700 at age 38, an autopsy revealed a body ravaged by genetic collapse. The doctors found his heart the size of a peppercorn, his lungs black, and his intestines rotted. His stomach was filled with fluid, and his head, they noted grimly, was full of water. Spain's last Habsburg king had been a walking medical report, a monarch undone not by war or conspiracy, but by centuries of poor breeding and worse medical advice. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a Europe-wide scramble for power that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, all indirectly, because one man's body couldn't produce an heir or properly process dinner. In the end, Charles II's table became the perfect symbol of his reign, ornate, cursed, and quietly collapsing under the weight of too much history. The good news, he had royal taste. The bad news, who did his autopsy report. If the Georgian era had a motto, it would probably be "too much is never enough." And no monarch embodied that sentiment quite like George IV, a man who didn't simply eat dinner but performed it. His appetite was legendary, his waistline epic, and his relationship with food one long, greasy love story. He didn't dine, he performed a one-man demolition derby on a buffet. The 18th century in Britain was a time of glittering elegance and glorious excess. It was the age of powdered wigs, towering hats, and liver damage in lace cuffs. The upper classes lived in perpetual competition to see who could outdo the others in extravagance, and food became their favourite weapon. Banquets stretched for hours, with courses so elaborate they required blueprints. It wasn't enough to be rich. You had to eat rich, preferably in front of people who couldn't afford salt. At the centre of this culinary carnival stood George IV, first as the Prince of Wales, then as king from 1820 to 1830. He was the Georgian answer to Henry VIII, minus the wives, but with even more waistcoat buttons under siege. Known for his vanity, charm, and catastrophic self-control, George turned dinning into an Olympic sport of self-destruction. His chefs prepared meals fit for several dozen people, all of them himself. At breakfast, which began around noon because mornings were for peasants, he would consume 2 pigeons, 3 eggs, a steak, a full bottle of brandy, and sometimes champagne for balance. Lunch was lighter, often consisting of only half a roasted partridge or cold beef with wine. Dinner, however, was where the fireworks began. Multi-course marathons of soups, fish, roasted meats, game pies, and desserts so sweet they could knock out a horse. He was said to eat until he could barely breathe, then recline dramatically, wheezing like a steam engine and declaring a magnificent repast. Even his contemporaries were appalled. One observer wrote that the prince ate like a man intent on punishing his enemies through digestion. Another remarked that George didn't so much dine as consume Europe. His nightly drinking bouts, which included wine, port, and occasionally liqueurs of his own invention, could make even the most enthusiastic sailor beg for mercy. By his late 30s, George's weight had ballooned to over 300 pounds. His neck had vanished into his collar, and he required a custom-built carriage simply to move between palaces. But George wasn't just a glutton. He was an artist of indulgence. Food was part of his personal mythology. He decorated his tables with silver platters the size of shields and hired chefs from France to prepare dishes that screamed sophistication. He once demanded that every dish served at Carlton House, his London palace, include truffles, whether they belonged there or not. It was said that he refused to eat anything that didn't sparkle, steam, or threaten to bankrupt someone. And yet, despite his extravagant tastes, his table manners were somewhere between theatrical and alarming. Witnesses described him shoveling food with such enthusiasm that gravy often achieved escape velocity. Servants would later scrub the royal dining room walls clean of flying fragments of pheasant. Dinner with the George was both a privilege and a workplace hazard. He loved to shock his guests with sudden improvements to etiquette. At one notorious dinner, he decided forks were an affectation and ate an entire roast chicken with his hands, though it was hard to argue when the host had royal authority and a drumstick. At another, he drunkenly challenged a general to a duel over the last slice of ham. The general wisely surrendered the ham, but it wasn't all comedy. There was tragedy in his appetite too. Behind the flamboyance lurked insecurity. George IV lived in an age of Enlightenment restraint and social judgment, yet he was incapable of either. His father, George III, was famous for frugality and madness. His son chose to compensate with extravagance and denial. Food became his comfort, his performance, his rebellion against a world that mocked his vanity and whispered about his failings. When his political reputation collapsed, he sought solace in the only realm he could still dominate, the dinner table. And dominate he did. His coronation banquet in 1821 was perhaps his greatest edible monument. It cost nearly $250,000. In today's money, that's millions. Featuring over 20,000 dishes, 1,000 bottles of wine, and 200 chefs working around the clock. The sheer logistics bordered on absurd. Tables stretched the length of Westminster Hall, decorated with golden candelabras and edible sculptures of classical gods. Guests were awestruck, until, inevitably, the king overindulged and had to be discreetly escorted out before dessert. George's appetite outlasted his body. By his later years, he suffered from gout so severe that even walking was torture. Physicians begged him to moderate his diet. Their advice was ignored with royal consistency. His health declined, but his dinner invitations did not. He continued to host feasts propped up on cushions, insisting he was quite fit, while wheezing between spoonfuls of turtle soup. When asked why he ate so much, he reportedly smiled and said, "'Cause I am king." That, perhaps, was the purest summary of the Georgian ethos. Beyond George himself, the Georgian court was equally indulgent. Nobles competed to outdo one another in culinary opulence. Food fights, literal ones, broke out at drunken gatherings, and duels occasionally followed over insulted chefs or missing pastries. A fashionable dinner might last 6 hours, feature 36 dishes, and end with guests sprawled under the table, half from drink and half from despair. By the end of George IV's reign, even his subjects had grown weary of his excess. Satirists drew him as a bloated figure drowning in pudding and port, while pamphlets mocked him as the prince of plumpness. His lavish dinners, once his symbols of national pride, had become metaphors for royal waste. When he finally died in 1830, a doctor reportedly remarked that the king's stomach contained more history than most museums. And perhaps it did. For in the story of George IV, the Georgian obsession with display reached its literal peak. A world where luxury became self-parody, and appetite swallowed empire whole. The good news? The table was magnificent. The bad news? So was the bill. When you think of Napoleon Bonaparte, you probably picture a military genius orchestrating the fall of empires, not a man hunched over a plate of cold chicken, inhaling it like a soldier under siege. Yet that's exactly how the Emperor of the French preferred to dine. Napoleon conquered Europe, reshaped the modern world, and rewrote the art of warfare, but he never quite figured out how to chew properly. He conquered Europe, but couldn't conquer indigestion. Despite commanding armies with mathematical precision, Napoleon treated his meals like military skirmishes, quick, aggressive, and preferably finished before anyone else noticed he was eating. His secretaries and valets described him as impatient to the point of madness when food was involved. The great strategist who could spend hours mapping out a battle would devour an entire dinner in 10 minutes, leaving behind a trail of crumbs and chaos that no empire could tidy up. Napoleon's relationship with food was purely functional. He didn't eat for pleasure. He ate to refuel. like a general refilling a cannon. His favourite meal, simple roast chicken, preferably served cold with a glass of Chambertin wine diluted with water. To his gourmet French chefs, this was sacrilege. They offered soufflés, sauces, and delicate pastries. He waved them away in favour of poultry and speed. His cook once lamented, "The emperor eats as if every meal were his last, and in a hurry to start the next campaign." This culinary minimalism wasn't born from frugality so much as obsession. Napoleon lived in a perpetual state of urgency. He viewed dining as a waste of time, a distraction from statecraft and conquest. He famously ordered his meals to be ready at any hour, within 15 minutes of my command. His servants learned to have dishes constantly prepared, reheated, and abandoned again as battles, meetings, or sudden mood swings interrupted the schedule. As a result, most of what he ate was either lukewarm or stone cold. If Michelin stars had existed, Napoleon's table would have earned one for efficiency under duress. On campaign, his habits became even stranger. The imperial field kitchen travelled with the army, an entire mobile operation designed to feed one man who barely noticed food existed. He would dine in his tent surrounded by maps, his generals waiting anxiously for decisions between bites. One aide recalled that the emperor would shovel in meat with one hand while writing dispatches with the other. A fork in one, Europe in the other. Often, he forgot to eat entirely, surviving on bread, garlic, and strong coffee. He could go 20 hours without food, then suddenly demand dinner at midnight and consume an entire chicken in silence. His coffee addiction bordered on the heroic. Napoleon was said to drink it by the gallon, so strong it could dissolve a horseshoe. His mornings began with several cups, often without milk or sugar, and he used it as fuel for his famously sleepless energy. "Coffee gives me ideas," he once said, a sentiment that might comfort every overworked student in history, but it also gave him crippling stomach pain. His valet recorded that the emperor suffered constant indigestion, cramps, and heartburn. He dismissed it as the inconvenience of genius, but his doctors called it something else entirely. Chronic gastritis, likely worsened by stress and an absolutely catastrophic diet. At official banquets, Napoleon's indifference to food bewildered his guests. His dinners at the Tuileries Palace lasted no more than 20 minutes, less time than it took to serve the soup. Courtiers who had spent hours preparing their finest conversation barely got a sentence out before the emperor stood up and left. "He dined like a soldier, not a king," one diplomat complained. "Before we had lifted our spoons, he had finished dessert." His wife, Empress Josephine, often lingered behind to salvage the social damage, smiling politely while her husband marched off to reorganize Europe. Still, for all his culinary austerity, Napoleon appreciated the symbolism of the table. He understood that dining could project power. His coronation banquet in 1804 was a spectacle of imperial branding. Mountains of roast meats, rivers of wine, and table settings glittering with gold. Every plate bore the imperial eagle. But even there he didn't linger. After a few bites, he rose abruptly and left the hall, leaving hundreds of guests halfway through their soup. The message was clear. France might dine, but Napoleon ruled. His soldiers, meanwhile, adored him for sharing their hardships. On campaign, he ate the same coarse bread and thin soup they did, squatting beside campfires instead of hosting lavish officer feasts. There were stories of him handing his own rations to starving troops, a gesture that made him appear less a distant emperor and more a comrade. He may have been the most powerful man in Europe, but at dinner he was simply the little corporal again, grumbling about cold meat and stiff bread like everyone else. Still, his stomach paid dearly for his discipline. As he aged, his digestion worsened. Chronic pain gnawed at him, leading his doctors to prescribe what 19th century medicine considered treatment, heavy doses of mercury, laudanum, and antimony. Unsurprisingly, this didn't help. Toward the end of his life, exiled on St. Helena, Napoleon's meals grew even sadder. Gone were the glittering feasts of the Tuileries. His table now consisted of British Army rations, served by indifferent guards. He complained constantly about the quality of the bread and the dryness of the wine. His former cook, Constant, wrote that the emperor's appetite dwindled, but his dignity never did. Even his crumbs fell with authority. In his final years, Napoleon's digestive troubles worsened into the illness that would kill him, most likely stomach cancer, though some historians suggest his lifelong habit of self-poisoning through stress and bad food didn't help. When he died in 1821, he left behind not just an empire in ruins, but also a cautionary tale in nutrition. Eat slowly, chew properly, and maybe conquer a salad once in a while. For a man who built and lost Europe between meals, Napoleon's table manners reveal something essential about his character. He saw food the way he saw everything, as a means to an end, another campaign to win quickly. He didn't feast to celebrate, he feasted to move on. In that sense, every dinner was Waterloo waiting to happen. The good news, he changed the world. The bad news, he did it on heartburn and chicken grease. Dinner with Queen Victoria was less a social event and more an extreme sport. The menu might have listed elegant roasts, fine puddings, and French sauces, but the real main course was anxiety. Her Majesty didn't just preside over her table, she ruled it with military precision. The slightest delay was insubordination, and if you blinked too long, your roast beef was gone. Victorian fine dining was an Olympic sport in panic eating. Victoria's reign, 1837 to 1901, saw the British Empire expand across the globe, but her true dominion was the dining room. Her table manners were famously rigid, a reflection of her sense of order and her lifelong determination to run her household with the same discipline as her government. The Queen believed that meals should reflect the moral fibre of the nation, efficient, controlled and devoid of frivolity. Unfortunately for her guests, this meant dinner was timed with the precision of a military drill and the mercy of a guillotine. Every royal banquet at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle followed an exacting ritual. The long mahogany table gleamed under chandeliers, covered in glittering silverware and floral arrangements so dense you could barely see your neighbour. Footmen stood like marble statues along the walls, ready to swoop in at a flick of the butler's gloved hand. The orchestra played softly from the gallery, the music swelling and fading with each course. It was all terribly grand right up until you tried to eat. Here's how it worked. The Queen was served first. Once she took her first bite, the rest of the table followed. So far, so civilised. But then came the twist. As soon as Victoria finished her course, no matter how fast that was, the entire table's plates were cleared away. No exceptions. The Queen's appetite set the pace for everyone else. And Victoria, bless her efficient soul, ate like a locomotive on a timetable. She didn't linger over conversation or pause for admiration. She ate briskly, efficiently, and without sentiment, a woman on a mission to prove that dinner was not pleasure, but duty. Guests quickly learned to cut, chew, and swallow at alarming speeds, because once the Queen put down her fork, their plate vanished mid-bite. Many newcomers made the rookie mistake of talking during dinner, a fatal error. They would glance up from conversation only to discover their venison had been whisked away, leaving them with nothing but an empty charger and a lifetime of regret. Diplomats, dukes, and visiting monarchs all fell victim to her merciless tempo. The Prince of Wales, future Edward VII, who preferred leisurely dining and long conversation, reportedly groaned through every royal dinner. The French ambassador once whispered to his neighbour, "C'est un repas ou un duel?" Is this a meal or a duel? Even Prime Minister Gladstone, known for his resilience, confessed that he left Buckingham Palace, dinners hungry, breathless, and profoundly afraid. Part of the problem was Victoria's own relationship with food. She loved hearty British fare, roast beef, potatoes, soups, puddings, but she was not a gourmand. Her husband, Prince Albert, preferred simpler, German-style meals, and together they cultivated an image of domestic modesty. Meals were wholesome, practical, and free of foreign ostentation except for the French chefs who cooked them. But Victoria's efficiency soon turned into tyranny. By middle age, she ate quickly out of habit, perhaps from years of palace routine, perhaps from decades of being perpetually cross about something. Her staff dreaded mealtimes. The royal kitchen was a world of high-speed coordination, where timing was life and overcooking was treason. Chefs would prepare elaborate multi-course meals, often 6 or 7 dishes, knowing that the Queen might demolish them all in under 25 minutes. Dishes that had taken hours to perfect were swept away half-eaten because Victoria simply didn't wait. One cook lamented, "Her Majesty eats as if chased by the clock itself." Even the table service had to be choreographed. The royal household employed plate maids, whose sole job was to ensure that every dish arrived hot, a nearly impossible task given the Queen's lightning pace. One butler described the ordeal as a ballet of terror performed in silence. When the Queen dined, the staff moved in synchronized harmony, gliding forward the moment her fork touched porcelain. If anyone stumbled, Victoria's glare could curdle cream. This frantic rhythm didn't just affect the servants, it terrified her guests into submission. Imagine being seated next to the Queen, trying to impress her with polite conversation while inhaling your soup like a Victorian vacuum. One ambassador reportedly choked on a fishbone during dinner, but refused to cough for fear of attracting attention. He sat purple-faced, nodding politely, while Victoria asked about trade agreements. He survived barely and never accepted another invitation. Yet despite its horrors, the Queen's table had purpose. It was symbolic discipline, a reflection of her belief that the monarchy should embody order and restraint in a world of chaos. To her, slow dining was moral decay. Efficiency was virtue. In an era of industrial revolution and empire, the Queen's rapid dinners mirrored Britain's obsession with punctuality and progress. If trains could run on time, so could digestion. Her table rules extended even to the royal family. Children and grandchildren were expected to eat in silence, back straight, elbows invisible. If one of them dared to fidget or laugh, the Queen's withering look could reduce them to ash. Princess Beatrice, her youngest daughter, once tried to explain that the children couldn't keep up with her pace. Victoria reportedly replied, "Then they must learn." The lesson was clear: you could not outrun the Queen, but you could at least try to chew faster. As Victoria aged, her appetite diminished, but her speed did not, even into her later years. When her health began to fail, she continued to dine at what one courtier called the speed of empire. Meals became shorter, quieter, and still terrifyingly efficient. Guests were relieved when dinner was over, not because they were full, but because they had survived. When the Queen died in 1901, her court mourned her deeply, but her chefs and servants probably took their first relaxed meal in decades. No longer would they live in fear of the royal fork. In retrospect, Victoria's dining habits encapsulate her reign perfectly. Disciplined, formidable, and utterly humorless, the triumph of duty over delight. The rest of Europe might have feasted on decadence, but Britain, under Victoria, learned to eat its pudding under pressure. The good news, dinner never dragged. The bad news, neither did the food. If Queen Victoria's dinners were exercises in restraint and punctual panic, her sons were the exact opposite, decadence with a cigar. When King Edward VII took the throne in 1901, Britain exhaled. After decades of moral austerity and digestive discipline, the Edwardian era arrived like a champagne cork popping loose from a century of repression, and no one embodied its indulgent spirit more enthusiastically than the new king. A royal dinner wasn't about eating. It was about seeing how much gossip could fit between the soup and the scandal. Edward VII, affectionately, and sometimes not so affectionately, called Bertie, was the human embodiment of overconsumption. He ate too much, drank too much, smoked too much, flirted too much, and enjoyed it all far too openly. While his mother had terrified guests into silent swallowing, Bertie turned the royal table into a stage for charm, flirtation, and unrepentant gluttony. Under his reign, the dinner table became a playground for the elite, a mix of high cuisine, heavy scandal, and even heavier sauces. At his coronation in 1902, the tone was set. The banquet was a parade of luxury that would have made Marie Antoinette blush. Course after course of elaborate French dishes, turtle soup, sole à la Normande, venison, pheasant, and a dessert cart that looked like a jewellery display, rolled out to a crowd of aristocrats so bedecked in diamonds they could have lit the room themselves. And when the king raised his glass, the empire raised it with him. The Edwardian age was the golden age of excess, a final glittering flare before the First World War turned the lights out. For the upper classes, dinner was no longer about survival or even sustenance, it was performance. An Edwardian hostess could rise or fall in society based entirely on her table settings. The number of forks became a form of social Darwinism. Men in white tie puffed cigars between courses, women whispered through clouds of perfume, and everyone competed to be the most interesting person in the room. And presiding over it all was the king himself, not the austere head of state, but the life of the party. Edward VII was a connoisseur of pleasure in all its forms, and he treated food like flirtation, abundant, intoxicating, and occasionally dangerous. He adored French cuisine, particularly the creations of Chef Auguste Escoffier, whose legendary cooking transformed dinner into edible theatre. Dishes with names like Suprême de Valais à la Reine and Filet de Sole à la Princesse graced royal tables, paired with endless wine and, inevitably, gossip. If Victoria's table had been a clockwork machine, Edward's was a carré. He didn't just dine, he hosted. Conversation was encouraged, laughter expected, and scandal almost guaranteed. The king had a gift for charm. He could make his guests feel like co-conspirators in some delightful secret. Except, of course, when the secret was that half the table had been romantically entangled with him. The king's appetites were legendary, and not merely culinary. His mistresses were as much fixtures of the Edwardian social scene as his cigars and waistcoats. Among them, Lily Langtry, Alice Keppel, and a parade of duchesses, actresses, and heiresses filled the gossip columns and dinner invitations alike. Bertie didn't separate food, politics, or romance. They were all courses of the same feast. One society wit once said, "At His Majesty's dinners, you are either the flavour of the month or the dish being served." The menu itself could rival a military campaign in scale. Dinner often began with oysters or consommé, followed by multiple meat courses, intricate vegetable dishes, soufflés and puddings swimming in brandy. The king adored roast beef, pheasant and game pies, washed down with champagne and port. He once famously declared, "A meal without wine is like a day without sunshine." Judging by his cellar, the man lived in permanent daylight. His dinners were not just indulgent, they were political stages. Deals were whispered over pudding, alliances forged between courses. Bertie, unlike his mother, believed that diplomacy happened best when everyone was tipsy. Foreign dignitaries adored him for it. At one dinner with the French ambassador, he toasted our eternal friendship with such enthusiasm that the two countries nearly signed an extra treaty just to keep up. Of course, all this excess came at a price, literally and physically. Edward's waistline expanded to match his empire. By his later years, he was over 200 pounds, with a belly so formidable it required custom-tailored military uniforms. His favourite restaurant in Paris, Maxim's, built an extra-wide chair to accommodate him. He enjoyed 7-course meals with the same focus Napoleon once gave to battle plans. And when he wasn't at table, he was at the club smoking cigars the size of small cannon shells. But while his dinners were magnificent, they were also a kind of moral theatre. The last act of an empire pretending its appetite had no consequence. Beyond the glitter of London salons, the lower classes were struggling with industrial poverty. In Edward's Britain, servants starved polishing silver that was used once and then stored for display. The contrast between the gilded dinner tables and the soot-stained factories could not have been starker. The Edwardian feast was, in many ways, the empire's final meal before the bill arrived. Yet for all its decadence, there was a charm to it. The Edwardian dinner was humanity's great balancing act, elegance teetering over disaster, conversation sparkling just enough to distract from the heart disease lurking in the corner. Bertie himself, though riddled with gout and heart troubles, refused to slow down. He ate, smoked, and laughed his way to the very end, dying fittingly after a hearty dinner and a cigar. When the news of his death spread in 1910, the age of silk waistcoats and scandalous toasts ended with him. The First World War loomed, and the glittering banquets of the Edwardian elite would soon be replaced by ration cards and soup lines. But for a brief, shimmering moment, England had lived gloriously, wastefully, hilariously, and on gossip, champagne and roast beef. The good news? Every night was a party. The bad news? So was the autopsy. Few dinner parties in history have escalated from awkward to apocalyptic quite like Rasputin's Last Supper. What began as a polite evening invitation in Petrograd quickly turned into one of history's most chaotic murder attempts, involving poisoned pastries, panic nobles, several bullets, and a man who refused to die on schedule. They poisoned him, shot him, drowned him. He still finished dessert. To understand why Russia's elite decided to assassinate a dinner guest who seemed more immortal than mortal, we need to step back to the crumbling twilight of the Romanov Empire. By 1916, Russia was a nation unravelling faster than its Tsar could button his uniform. World War I was bleeding the country dry. Revolution was simmering in the streets, and at the centre of the royal court's chaos stood one unwashed Siberian mystic, Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. He was part monk, part healer, and part problem no one could get rid of. Rasputin had gained the undying trust of Tsarina Alexandra, who believed his strange charisma and dubious miracles could save her haemophiliac son, Alexei. Unfortunately, because the rest of Russia, particularly the aristocracy, believed he was saving no one but himself. Rumours spread that Rasputin was controlling royal decisions, sleeping with half the court, and corrupting the monarchy with vodka and voodoo. By the winter of 1916, the nobles decided that the only way to save the empire was to serve justice, à la carte. The conspirators included Prince Felix Yusupov, a wealthy aristocrat with a taste for drama, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin. Their plan was simple in theory and spectacularly stupid in practice. Invite Rasputin to dinner, poison him, and quietly dispose of the body before breakfast. On the night of December 29, 1916, Yusupov's lavish Moika palace glowed with candlelight ready for its most infamous guest. Downstairs, in a basement dining room prepared for secrecy, the table was laid with champagne, cakes, and a generous helping of cyanide, enough poison to kill a platoon, all lovingly baked into pastries and dissolved in the wine. Upstairs, a gramophone played cheerful music to cover any suspicious noises. It was, as murder attempts go, delightfully civilized. Rasputin arrived dressed like a man halfway between prophet and lumberjack, scruffy beard, peasant tunic, eyes that could melt steel. Yusupov greeted him warmly, led him to the basement and offered him the poisoned cakes. The monk cheerfully accepted, crossed himself and ate. Then nothing happened. Minutes passed. The poison refused to cooperate. Rasputin chatted amiably, complimented the pastries and asked for more wine. Yusupov's pulse doubled with every sip the man took. The prince later wrote that Rasputin drank as if he were toasting his own immortality. The cake disappeared. The champagne vanished. Rasputin simply sat back and smiled. The poisoner began to sweat. An hour later, with Rasputin still perfectly alive and humming folk songs, Yusupov panicked. He excused himself, ran upstairs, and informed the other conspirators that the poison had failed. The devil, it seemed, was gluten-tolerant. They handed him a revolver. "Then shoot him," they said. Yusupov returned downstairs, trembling but determined. Rasputin was still at the table, reaching for more dessert. The prince raised the gun, fired once, and Rasputin collapsed to the floor. Finally, a success. The conspirators toasted his demise with nervous relief. They poured more champagne, congratulated each other, and left the body cooling on the carpet. And then Rasputin got back up. According to Yusupov's later account, which reads like a gothic fever dream, the monk opened his eyes, muttered a prayer, and lunged. Bleeding, staggering, but very much alive, Rasputin chased the prince through the palace, roaring like an unkillable bear. Yusupov screamed for help, and another conspirator, Vladimir Purishkevich, grabbed his gun and fired once, twice, 3 times. Rasputin fell again, groaning. Convinced it was finally over, they wrapped his body in a rug and hauled it into the icy night. But history's most stubborn dinner guest wasn't done yet. On their way to dump him in the frozen Neva River, the killers swore they saw him move again. Out of sheer panic, Purishkevich fired once more, a final bullet to the head. Then they flung him into the water and fled. When his body was discovered days later, the autopsy revealed something chilling. Rasputin's lungs contained water, meaning even after poison and bullets he had still been breathing when he hit the river. Whatever else he was, the man was not a quitter. The attempted dinner assassination of Rasputin became instant legend, a symbol of everything absurd and doomed about the Romanov world. It was as if the empire itself had tried to kill its own corruption and failed spectacularly. The aristocrats believed they were saving Russia from a demonic influence. In reality, they were staging a dark farce that perfectly captured the empire's collapse. Within a year, the monarchy would fall, the revolution would rise, and the conspirators would scatter or die in exile. And Rasputin, in death, he achieved exactly what his killers feared most: immortality. His story spread across the world as both cautionary tale and macabre punchline. Pamphlets painted him as a devil, mystic or miracle worker. The legend of the man who could not be killed became a grim prophecy for Russia itself, an empire that refused to die cleanly, poisoning itself again and again until it finally drowned in its own revolution. The irony of Rasputin's final meal was that it revealed the perfect metaphor for the Romanovs' last days. A banquet of excess, a toast to control, and a complete failure to stomach reality. He entered the night as the Tsarina's holy man and left as folklore. His assassins went home to wash their hands. History, however, never did. The good news, he was finally full. The bad news, so was the never. Few monarchs have ever lost their throne with such style or over such excellent dining as King Edward VIII. His reign was short, scandalous, and seasoned with the faint aroma of rebellion and perfume. Before he became the only British monarch to voluntarily step down, Edward didn't just flirt with danger, he invited it to dinner. And that danger came in the form of one woman, Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who turned royal supper into constitutional crisis. He gave up the throne for love and decent table conversation. The story of the abdication dinner begins long before the famous radio broadcast where Edward declared, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." Long before that solemn speech, there were glittering tables, hushed toasts, and the clinking of crystal glasses in London's most exclusive restaurants, each one echoing the sound of the monarchy's slow undoing. As the Prince of Wales, Edward was Britain's most eligible bachelor and its most unpredictable diner. His father, King George V, ate with the mechanical precision of a man who believed punctuality was a moral virtue. Edward, by contrast, treated meals like jazz, informal, improvised, and occasionally scandalous. He loathed the rigid rituals of Buckingham Palace dining, the timed courses, the endless toasts, the suffocating silence. Once he became king in January 1836, he set out to modernise not just the monarchy but its menu. At his own dinner parties, protocol was replaced by warmth and laughter. He invited artists, politicians, and, shockingly, commoners. He enjoyed light conversation, popular music, and cocktails before dinner, a novelty in Brielle circles. But the real disruption came when Wallis Simpson entered the picture, elegant, sharp-witted, and twice divorced. To Edward, she was everything the royal world wasn't: alive, unscripted, and capable of making him laugh over the soup course. Their dinners together became the talk of London, whispered about in clubs, dissected in newspapers, and nervously discussed in Parliament. At Fort Belvedere, his private residence near Windsor, Edward hosted intimate suppers where Wallis was treated not as a guest but as hostess. This, in royal terms, was the equivalent of publicly tattooing her name on the Constitution. There she was, pouring wine for dukes, flirting with foreign dignitaries, and choosing the seating plan, all while the Archbishop of Canterbury likely prayed for divine indigestion. The menu, like the couple, defied tradition. Wallis favoured lighter, American-style dishes, chicken salads, souffleurs and puddings that didn't require an army of footmen to serve. Edward, ever smitten, abandoned stodgy roasts and took to her tastes with youthful enthusiasm. He even learned to make Wallis's scrambled eggs himself, an act that horrified his staff more than abdication ever could. Imagine the King of England in silk shirt sleeves stirring eggs in the royal kitchen, grinning like a schoolboy. It was domestic bliss, or blasphemy, depending on who you asked. But outside that cosy dining room, the empire was choking on its supper. The British establishment was scandalised. Divorce, especially for women, was still considered a moral plague. The idea that the Supreme Governor of the Church of England might marry a twice-divorced American woman with 2 living ex-husbands was political cyanide. The press, bound by deference, remained publicly silent, but rumours exploded across Europe. In Paris, journalists dined out on gossip about the American woman who had bewitched the king. Behind palace doors, tension boiled. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin met the king several times over tea and sandwiches to explain in increasingly firm tones that marrying Wallis would be impossible. Edward, ever polite but stubborn, refused to see the problem. "You can't abdicate for a sandwich," Baldwin muttered later, but he underestimated Edward's appetite for trouble. By December 1936, the crisis reached its inevitable climax. Wallis fled to France to avoid further scandal, and the king prepared to renounce his throne. On the evening of December 10th, the night before his public abdication, Edward hosted a final dinner at Fort Belvedere. It was an intimate affair, a handful of friends, loyal servants, and silence heavy enough to slice with the carving knife. The table was modest, set with the simple fare, consommé, roast chicken, and a pudding no one touched. The wine, however, flowed freely. Witnesses said Edward was calm, almost cheerful, as he toasted his guests. "The time has come," he said softly. "I have made my decision." Some wept, others raised their glasses in stunned respect. It was the last dinner of a king, eaten not in opulence but in resignation. The next morning he signed the instrument of abdication. That night in Paris, Wallis dined alone. Their reunion days later was bittersweet. The couple lived out their years in exile, first in France, then across Europe, then the Bahamas, hosting elegant but faintly melancholy dinner parties. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they became known, surrounded themselves with the glamour of a world that no longer existed. Champagne, caviar, and guests who gossiped, as if the empire hadn't moved on without them. And yet, beneath the glitter, there was irony. The man who had once been the most powerful figure in the British Empire now measured his evenings not in speeches or treaties, but in seating charts and soufflés. Wallis continued to charm her guests. The Duke continued to adore her, and together they became living proof that sometimes the most revolutionary act in history is sitting down to dinner with the wrong person. The abdication. Dinner wasn't really about food. It was about defiance served with silver cutlery. It was the moment when love triumphed over duty, and duty quietly left the room, muttering about decorum. In a century filled with revolutions, wars, and overthrown monarchs, Edward VIII's rebellion was uniquely British. Calm, polite, and perfectly catered. The good news, he finally found someone worth giving up his crown for. The bad news, Britain lost its king and its best dinner guest. In the gilded halls of Tudor England, no one ate without a hint of fear. Not because the cooks were bad, quite the opposite, but because every meal might be your last. And at the head of this anxious culinary court sat Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign turned dinner into a paranoid performance of survival. Nothing says royal dining like 6 people tasting your soup and one of them not waking up. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom where food wasn't just sustenance, It was politics, and often assassination on a plate. Her father, Henry VIII, had set the tone, a monarch who ate enough for 3 men and trusted no one while doing it. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had learned the hard way that a royal meal could lead straight to the Tower. By the time Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, England was a nation of plotters, spies, and people who believed arsenic was a valid seasoning. She had every reason to believe that someone, somewhere, was trying to flavour her dinner with treason. The Queen's paranoia, or more accurately, her precaution, became legendary. Every meal she ate was subjected to a gauntlet of inspections worthy of a military campaign. The royal kitchens at Whitehall, Hampton Court and Greenwich were like fortresses of gastronomy, massive, bustling and heavily guarded. Servants were forbidden to speak freely, and anyone caught lingering too long near the royal pantry could find themselves transferred to the Tower for further seasoning. Before a single morsel reached Elizabeth's lips, it had been tasted by at least 3 different officials, sometimes more. The process was theatrical. A food taster sampled each dish in front of witnesses, waited several minutes to see if their complexion turned an interesting shade of blue, and only then was the food declared safe for the Queen. There are accounts of meals that cooled entirely while courtiers waited to see if the tester survived the starter. In one infamous incident, a taster reportedly collapsed after sampling a dish of eel pie, only for it to be discovered that the poor man had choked, not been poisoned. The Queen's appetite recovered slowly, but her suspicion tripled overnight. The ritual extended beyond the table. Every utensil, cup and napkin was guarded like state secrets. Elizabeth's goblets were made of gold not for vanity, but because gold was believed to neutralize toxins, an early form of luxury science. Her plates were inspected for scratches, potential hiding spots for powdered poisons, and her wine was poured only by trusted hands. Even her salt was kept under lock and key. After all, in a court where nobles literally murdered each other for favour, a pinch could mean peril. Elizabeth's fear wasn't unfounded. The 16th century was the golden age of creative assassination. Italian courts had perfected poisons with names like inheritance powder, and the Vatican's pharmacists were rumoured to have entire recipes for killing discreetly between courses. Rumours swirled that enemies of the crown had attempted to smuggle tainted fruit or perfumed gloves into her chambers. The Queen's own physician, Dr. Burko, famously refused to let her try certain new dishes, warning that innovation is the ally of death. Elizabeth's response? Then I shall innovate with caution. Translation: bring me the pie, but make someone else eat it first. Her kitchen became a theatre of terror and precision. The royal staff numbered in the hundreds. Cooks, butchers, brewers, tasters, carvers and servers, each sworn to secrecy. The kitchens at Hampton Court could feed 600 people a day, but when it came to the Queen, even the simplest meal was treated like a military operation. Spices were weighed under guard, water was drawn from special wells, and bread was baked only by the royal bakers, whose families were vetted for loyalty. One chronicler joked that it was safer to join the navy than to cook for Elizabeth. Despite the tension, Elizabeth had a healthy appetite, especially for sweets. She adored sugar, which in Tudor England was both expensive and toxic. Physicians warned her about sugar sickness, but she brushed them off, and probably their molars too. She devoured candied violets, sugar sculptures, and marzipan castles so intricate they could have doubled as architectural blueprints. It was said that her teeth turned black from her sugar obsession, though in true Elizabethan fashion, the ladies of court copied her royal decay by blackening their own teeth with soot. Nothing said loyalty like matching cavities. Meals themselves were ceremonious, but never relaxed. Elizabeth dined in public on occasion, seated beneath a canopy of state while courtiers watched her eat in reverent silence. Her meals were modest compared to her father's feasts. She preferred light game, fruit and wine, but every forkful was an exercise in self-control. Ambassadors who dined with her often remarked on her composure. Her Majesty doth chew as if considering the fate of nations, which in fairness she probably was. Her food paranoia extended even into hospitality. When hosting foreign envoys, Elizabeth would sometimes invite them to dine, then refuse to eat herself, watching keenly as they did. It was both a power play and a test. If they flinched, they were weak. If they kept eating, perhaps they were plotting. Either way, the Queen got what she wanted, and control. Even in her later years, when her health declined, Elizabeth remained vigilant. She distrusted new cooks, new recipes, and anyone too eager to pour her wine. Her final years were marked by exhaustion, grief, and an empty throne at dinner. Yet the same meticulous caution that kept her from poisoning also kept her alive, outlasting assassins, suitors, and rivals. Elizabeth I survived an age when death came disguised as dessert. Her meals were cold by the time they reached her. Her tasters were nervous wrecks, and her appetite was seasoned with suspicion. But that very paranoia gave her what every Tudor monarch craved most: longevity. The good news, she ruled for 45 years. The bad news, every dinner was a murder mystery. If medieval banquets were about survival and Victorian ones about speed, the 20th century turned dining into diplomacy, a high-stakes performance where the menu carried more political weight than the speeches. Every fork was symbolic, every toast a treaty, and every canapé a potential crisis. Because nothing quite defines modern statecraft like the possibility that one wrong appetizer could derail world peace. Diplomacy, where one bad canapé can trigger an international incident. By the dawn of the 1900s, royal and presidential dinners had evolved into meticulously choreographed spectacles of etiquette. They were designed not to nourish, but to impress. When monarchs ruled, the goal was opulence. When presidents ruled, the goal was neutrality, a feast bland enough that no one could possibly take offence. And yet history shows that even the most cautious menus and carefully staged smiles couldn't protect leaders from the oldest enemy of all, human awkwardness. Take, for instance, the Great Wine Disaster of 1938. When King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, visited Paris to strengthen Anglo-French relations. The dinner at the Élysée Palace was intended to showcase Franco-British friendship, which it did, right up until a nervous waiter tripped, spilling a full carafe of red wine across the Queen's pale blue gown. Witnesses gasped. The orchestra froze. The Queen smiled faintly, murmured, "C'est la guerre," and continued eating. The French newspapers, ever poetic, called it a toast unplanned, yet perfectly symbolic. Anglo-French unity survived. The waiter's career did not. Fast forward to 1961, the glamorous Kennedy state dinner for the Shah of Iran. Everything gleamed, chandeliers, silverware, Jackie's pearls. The problem arose during the toasts. President Kennedy, ever the orator, lifted his glass with charm. The Shah responded in kind, except no one had remembered to provide his interpreter. Half the room smiled politely as the Shah gave what was, apparently, a 5-minute speech about Persian friendship and agricultural reform, while Kennedy nodded as though he'd understood every word. The next morning, the Washington Post called it a victory for diplomacy if not communication. Then there was the peanut panic of 1977, when newly inaugurated President Jimmy Carter hosted a reception in honor of the diplomatic corps. Eager to celebrate his Georgian roots, Carter insisted that peanuts, his family's famous crop, feature prominently on the menu. Unfortunately, the event's guest list included several ambassadors with severe peanut allergies, one of whom had to be rushed out mid-toast. The Secret Service was nearly forced to add antihistamines to the national security protocol. The next day, the press dubbed it the snack that nearly ended détente. Europe was no better. At a 1978 dinner in Buckingham Palace for the Italian president, a footman reportedly fainted while serving soup, sending a steaming tidal wave of consommé directly into the royal lap. Ever the professional, Queen Elizabeth II simply dabbed at her dress, remarked, "We shall call it a baptism of friendship," and continued the meal. The footman retired early, to a distant posting in the Falklands, rumour had it. Even the Soviets couldn't escape dinner disaster. At a Kremlin banquet in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to charm Margaret Thatcher with a symbolic toast, only for the translator to confuse the Russian word for spirit, duch, with vodka. The Iron Lady raised her glass and said, "Then to vodka it is," downing the shot in one gulp. The Politburo followed her lead. Half the Soviet leadership spent the next morning reconsidering perestroika through a hangover haze. But perhaps the gold medal in state dinner chaos belongs to the Mi-1 banquet in Beijing, the first such event between the US and China. It was historic, delicate, and choreographed down to the last chopstick. Unfortunately, Nixon, not known for his grace, attempted to show cultural respect by using chopsticks himself. The results were seismic. At one point, a slippery piece of Peking duck shot across the table, landing in Premier Zhou Enlai's teacup. The room froze. Zhou smiled thinly, lifted the cup and drank. "A new flavour," he said. Nixon reportedly muttered, "God bless him." Détente survived. And then came the toast of doom, 1976, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito, hosting a dinner for Queen Elizabeth II, raised his glass for a solemn toast to Anglo-Japanese friendship. Unfortunately, the British national anthem began playing mid-speech, prompting the entire British delegation to stand and remain frozen in respectful silence, while Hirohito kept talking. For 2.5 minutes, the Emperor toasted an empty room of rigid, silent Brits. The palace orchestra, unaware of the chaos it caused, simply carried on. International friendship endured barely. The 20th century's obsession with media coverage only amplified the pressure. Cameras meant every mishap lived forever. In 1981, US First Lady Nancy Reagan hosted Prince Charles and Princess Diana in the White House. Everything was immaculate, until Diana's gown snagged on a chair leg as she stood to dance. She freed herself gracefully, but the tabloids seized the moment. "Cinderella trips," one headline sneered, missing the irony that even fairy tale dinners come with splinters. Then there are the culinary blunders that history forgot but diplomats never did. A visiting delegation from India once found themselves served roast beef in London. A US ambassador in the Middle East accidentally toasted with champagne in front of the guests' forbidden alcohol. One African dignitary was nearly served pork at a banquet in his honour, stopped only by a frantic aide whispering, "That's not diplomacy, that's disaster." Every menu since has been vetted with the precision of a nuclear launch code. By the late 20th century, state dinners became less about indulgence and more about image control. Presidents rehearsed toasts, royals practiced smiles, and chefs learned to balance cuisine with caution. Yet despite decades of planning, the fundamental rule remained. No dinner is safe when national pride is on the table. After all, a treaty can be rewritten, but a spilled soup on the Queen's lap, that's forever. The good news? Modern leaders learned that diplomacy is best served with dessert. The bad news? The dessert sometimes fights back. If medieval banquets were about power and Victorian dinners about control, then modern royal feasts are about damage control. In the 21st century, no king, queen or crown prince can lift a fork without 5 cameras, 12 PR agents, and an anxious palace aide praying the soufflé doesn't collapse. The crown may shine, the table may glitter, but somewhere in the royal kitchen, someone's definitely crying over a soufflé. Royal dinners have always reflected their times, mirrors made of silver, polished to project perfection. But in today's age of instant headlines and relentless scrutiny, a royal banquet isn't just dinner. It's live theatre streamed to the world. One wrong bite, one misplaced toast, one napkin folded the wrong way, and suddenly you're trending for all the wrong reasons. Take the modern state banquet, once a display of imperial grandeur, now a cross between a diplomatic summit and a cooking show. Cameras capture every course, reporters decode every glance, and royal watchers analyse every fork angle, like theologians interpreting scripture. The table itself is still majestic. Hundreds of glittering wine glasses aligned like crystal soldiers, gold flatware polished to blinding perfection, and floral centerpieces that could pay off a small nation's debt. But behind the elegance lies an invisible army: chefs, planners, florists, lighting experts, sound technicians, and media advisors, all working feverishly to ensure that nothing more scandalous than a lukewarm soup occurs. Yet even with this precision, disaster always hovers like an uninvited duchess. In 2011, during a banquet at Buckingham Palace for the Obamas, one of the footmen mistakenly poured water into a wine glass meant for the US president. The moment passed quietly, but not quietly enough. Zoom lenses caught it. Watergate 2.0, joked the tabloids, because no royal event is too sacred to escape a pun. Then there are the menus, meticulously crafted to avoid offence. Centuries ago, a monarch might have proudly served swan or peacock as a flex of power. Today, palace chefs pore over spreadsheets of dietary restrictions and cultural sensitivities. A royal banquet now has more allergen labels than a grocery store. Garlic? Risky. Pork? Political suicide. Spices? Only if they're diplomatically mild. Somewhere between the amuse-bouche and the anxiety, royal dining has become less about flavour and more about public relations, and yet the pressure to impress never faded. It simply changed form. In the Instagram era, the plate itself is political. When King Charles III hosted a state banquet for environmental leaders, the menu was almost entirely vegetarian, served on vintage porcelain to emphasise sustainability. Critics applauded his green gastronomy, while others mocked it as lettuce diplomacy. It turns out that saving the planet is easier than pleasing Twitter. The truth is, modern royal kitchens now resemble war rooms with aprons. The head chef coordinates with diplomats, the palace communications team, and occasionally even the intelligence service, just in case someone tries to sneak in a symbolic protest via the pastry course. Everything from portion size to plate colour is planned for psychological effect. Too big a meal looks indulgent, too small looks cheap. Even dessert can send a message. Chocolate mousse for peace, perhaps, or lemon tart for economic austerity. And let's not forget the seating arrangements, still the silent battlefield of international relations. In the old days, proximity to the monarch was a matter of hierarchy. Now it's a matter of headlines. Sitting one seat too far from a royal could start rumours of diplomatic frost. Sitting too close could spark gossip about inappropriate warmth. When Queen Elizabeth II hosted President Trump in 2019, the seating plan was reportedly revised 5 times before the final version was approved. Each adjustment weighed for optics, alliances, and the likelihood of someone making awkward small talk about Brexit. While the stakes have changed, the symbolism hasn't. Every modern royal meal is still, in essence, a negotiation, not of land or titles, but of image. The food isn't meant to surprise, it's meant to reassure. It must whisper continuity while shouting relevance. In the 21st century, the royal table is less a place of eating, and more a stage of being seen eating well. The irony, of course, is that beneath all this polish, royal banquets remain as chaotic as ever. Kitchens still erupt in whispered panic, soufflés still fall, and waiters still trip at exactly the wrong time. A single camera flash can immortalise a grimace as a diplomatic rift. A half-second's hesitation before clinking glasses can become tension between monarch and minister. Even laughter is risky, too loud and it's frivolous, too quiet and it's suspicious. But for all the stress, the spectacle endures, because the royal dinner is one of the last living rituals of monarchy. It's the glittering illusion that the past still matters, that grace and ceremony can survive in a world of smartphones and sound bites. The food may be tepid by the time the cameras are done, but the symbolism is piping hot. And so the show continues. The tiaras sparkle, the trumpets announce, and somewhere behind the banquet hall doors, a palace chef mutters a prayer to St. Julia Child. Because while the world's eyes are fixed on the royal smile, the true drama unfolds in the kitchen, where timing, temperature, and terror simmer together under silver lids. In the end, royal banquets have evolved from political minefields to PR masterpieces. They no longer risk rebellion, but they do risk ridicule. and yet they remain oddly comforting. The last shared fantasy that somewhere, someone is still polishing silver for the sake of civilization. The good news, the monarchy learned to survive the camera. The bad news, the camera never blink, especially when the souffle sinks.